The roof went on in sections. John held the beams steady, while Elias Pritchard drove nails with a rhythm that never varied. 3 strikes per nail, no wasted motion. The young man worked like he'd been framing houses his whole life, but John had seen his hands that first day. Soft palms, no calluses. Whatever Elias had been before he showed up on that road, it wasn't a carpenter. "That's the last of it," Elias said. He set the hammer down and wiped his face with his sleeve. "We got a roof." John looked up at the pine boards stretching across the frame. Gaps showed between some of them where the wood hadn't been planed perfect, but it would keep the rain off. "Need to tar the seams before winter." "Winter's 4 months off. Takes time to do it right." Elias grinned. "Everything takes time with you. Next, you'll be telling me we need to season the wood first." "Wouldn't hurt." They climbed down and stood in what would be the main room. Sunlight cut through the gaps in the roof, throwing bars of gold across the stone foundation. John's old house had sat on these same stones. He could still see the scorch marks where the fire had burned hottest. "You think about what it looked like before?" Elias asked. "Some. Must be strange building on top of what was." John picked up a length of board they'd cut wrong and carried it outside. "Strange is living in it after." Elias followed him out. They had a small camp set up near the well, 2 bedrolls, a fire ring, a canvas tarp strung between posts for shade. John had offered to let Elias sleep in the barn's old root cellar, but the young man said he preferred the open air, said walls made him nervous. John dropped the board on a scrap pile and went to check the fire. Coals still glowed from breakfast. He added kindling and got flames going, then filled the coffee pot from the bucket. "How long you figure till it's done?" Elias asked. "The house?" "Yeah. 6 weeks if the weather holds, 8 if it don't." Elias sat down on a stump and pulled off his hat. His hair was dark and curled at the ends, and he had the kind of face women probably looked at twice. Sharp jaw, easy smile. He was maybe 25 but carried himself older. "That's a lot of time to spend hammering," Elias said. "You got somewhere else to be?" "Not particularly." He watched John set the pot on the fire. "Just seems like there's faster ways to make a life." "Like what?" "I don't know. Something that don't involve starting from scratch." John sat on the foundation stones and waited for the coffee to boil. The sun felt good on his back. His shoulder had quit aching finally. The bullet wound healed to a puckered scar he barely noticed anymore. "Most things worth having, you got to build them yourself." "You believe that?" "I'm here, ain't I?" Elias laughed. "Yeah, you're here. In the middle of nowhere, building a house you'll live in alone, on land that's already got graves on it." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "No offense, John, but that don't sound like much of a life." "It's the one I got." "Could be different, though." John looked at him. "Different how?" "I'm just saying there's opportunities. Towns growing out west, mines opening up. Man with your skills could do well." "What skills are those?" "Don't play dumb. I heard the stories in Bentwood. The McClory gang. 6 men, all dead or scattered. They say you hunted them down one by one." "People talk." "They do. But they ain't lying, are they?" The coffee started perking. John reached for 2 tin cups and filled them both, handed one to Elias. The young man took it but didn't drink, just held it and watched the steam rise. "Point is," Elias said, "you got a reputation. That's worth something." "Not to me." "Maybe it should be." Elias sipped the coffee, made a face. "You make this strong." "Keeps you awake." "I don't have trouble staying awake." They sat quiet for a while. A hawk circled over the ridge where Marion Crossing lay buried. John watched it ride the thermals, wings spread wide and still. "You ever think about what comes next?" Elias asked. "Next after what?" "After the house is done, after you're sitting in there alone every night with nothing but memories for company." John didn't answer. He'd thought about it plenty, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The house was something to build, a purpose that got him through the days. But Elias was right. When it was finished, then what? "I got an idea," Elias said. "Been thinking about it since I got here. Way I see it, we make a good team. You know building, I know people. We could hire on some help, get this place done in 3 weeks instead of 8, then we could—" The walls went up over the next 10 days. John worked until his hands bled, until the blisters broke and calloused over. Elias matched him board for board, nail for nail, never complaining. They spoke less as the work went on. John figured that was fine. Words didn't build houses. On the 11th night, Elias broke the pattern. They'd just finished supper, beans and salt pork cooked over the fire. John was cleaning the pan with sand when Elias pulled a bottle from his bedroll. Whiskey, sealed with wax. The glass caught the firelight. "Where'd that come from?" John asked. "Bought it in Bentwood last week when I rode in for nails." Elias worked the cork loose and took a drink. "Been saving it for when we got the walls up." "Walls ain't finished." "Close enough." Elias held the bottle out. "You want some?" John took it. The whiskey burned going down, good burn, better than the rot gut they sold at Rosa's. He handed it back and Elias drank again, longer this time. "You ever think about what you'd do with real money?" Elias asked. "Like how much?" "Enough to buy land. Good land, not this hard scrabble patch. Somewhere with water, year-round timber, maybe a town close enough to sell to?" Elias stared at the fire. "Enough to hire hands so you ain't breaking your back every day just to stay even." "That's a lot of money." "It is." "You got that kind of money?" Elias laughed. "If I did, you think I'd be here hammering nails?" John picked up a stick and poked at the coals. Sparks rose and died in the dark. "Then why talk about it?" "Because talking about a thing is the first step to having it. That philosophy? That's practicality." Elias took another drink. "You know what kills most men out here? It ain't Indians or outlaws or sickness. It's settling. They find a piece of dirt, build a shack, scrape by till they're too old to work. Then they die. Never had nothing, never were nothing. Your point? My point is you're headed down that same road. Building a house on burned ground, living with ghosts." Elias looked at him. "You're better than that." John stood up and walked to the well, drew up a bucket and drank from the dipper. The water tasted like iron and earth. When he turned around, Elias was standing behind him. "There's a bank in Bentwood," Elias said. John set the dipper down. "I know there is. Every Friday they take in deposits from the mines, pay shipments, assay receipts. By Saturday morning there's between $8,000 and $12,000 sitting in that vault. You been watching it?" "I've been paying attention." Elias moved closer. The firelight threw his shadow long across the ground. "The bank's old, built before the war. The vault door is solid, but the walls are just brick and plaster. A man could go through them with a sledgehammer in under 5 minutes. A man could also get shot. Not if he's smart about it. Not if he plans it right." Elias pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to John. "I drew this up. Look at it." John opened the paper. It was a crude map of Bentwood's main street with the bank marked in the center. Times were written next to different buildings, when the marshal made his rounds, when the saloon closed, when the mercantile opened. "You've been planning this a while," John said. 3 weeks. Since the day I showed up here." Elias pointed at the map. "Saturday before dawn. Marshal sleeps late on Saturdays, everyone knows it. We go in through the back, through the wall, take what's in the vault and ride out before the town wakes up. 2 men, 2 horses, $6,000 each." John folded the paper and handed it back. "No." "Just no? You won't even think about it?" "Don't need to think about it." Elias took the paper and shoved it back in his pocket. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong." You had no problem hunting down 6 men and killing them. They had it coming. And the banker don't? You know Samuel Hendricks. Fat bastard charges 20% interest on loans, forecloses on families when they can't pay. He's got more blood on his hands than any outlaw I ever met. That ain't my concern. Then what is your concern, John? Elias moved in front of him. Building this house? Living out here alone till you die? That's not a life, that's just slow suicide. John walked back to the fire and sat down. His shoulder ached where the old wound pulled. You should ride out tomorrow. I'm not leaving. Then I'll say it plain. I ain't robbing no bank with you. I ain't robbing nothing with nobody. That part of my life is done. Elias stayed by the well. When he spoke, his voice came out different, harder. Done? You dug up your guns 6 weeks ago. You strapped them on and killed men. You think you can just bury them again and pretend it didn't happen? I can try. You'll fail. Elias walked back to the fire and sat across from John. I've seen men like you before. Men who try to put the devil back in the bottle after they let him out. It don't work. The ghost's always there, waiting. You don't know nothing about it. I know more than you think. Elias drank from the bottle, then set it between them. My father was a lawman, Texas Ranger, spent his whole life chasing bad men, putting them in the ground. Then one day he decided he was done, retired, bought a farm, tried to live peaceful. What happened? 3 men came to rob him, former outlaws he'd sent to prison, got out and wanted revenge. He told them to take what they wanted and leave. Elias looked at the fire. They killed him anyway, burned the farm. My mother died in the fire. John didn't say nothing. You know what I learned from that? Elias asked. I learned that peace is a lie men tell themselves so they can sleep at night. The world is full of wolves, John. You can be a wolf or you can be sheep, but you can't be both. Your father wasn't sheep. No, but he tried to be, and it got him killed. Elias stood up. That bank job is happening. I'm doing it with you or without you, but with you it's clean. Nobody gets hurt. Without you, he shrugged. Things might get messier. You threatening the town? I'm stating facts. I need money to get where I'm going. I can take it quiet, or I can take it loud. Your choice determines which. John looked up at him. Where you going that you need stolen money to get there? Somewhere I can build something that matters. Not a house, John. An empire. Elias smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You could be part of it. Instead, you're choosing to hammer nails until your back gives out. I made a promise. To a dead woman. John stood up fast. Elias didn't move, just met his eyes steady. That's right, Elias said. She's dead, and all the promises in the world won't bring her back. You want to honor her? Then live. Really live, not this half-alive thing you're doing now. John's hands had curled into fists. He forced them open. Get off my land. It ain't even your land. You ain't got a deed, ain't paid taxes in 2 years. Legally, this place belongs to the territory. Elias picked up the whiskey bottle. But I'll go. Give you time to think about it. I'll be back in 3 days. You can give me your answer then. My answer's no. We'll see. Elias walked to where his bedroll lay and started gathering his things. He worked quick, rolling his blanket tight and tying it with rope. When he had everything, he threw it over his shoulder and looked at John one more time. You think you're different than me, Elias said. You think because you loved somebody once that makes you better. But we're the same, John. We're both killers. Only difference is I don't apologize for it. He walked to where his horse was picketed near the barn ruins. John watched him saddle up and mount. The young man sat there a moment, looking at the half-built house. That's a nice frame, Elias said. Be a shame if something happened to it. You threatening me now? No, just observing how fragile things are. How easy it is to lose what you're trying to build. Elias turned his horse toward the road. 3 days, John. Think about what I said. He rode off into the dark. John stood by the fire until the hoofbeats faded and there was nothing but silence and the pop of burning wood. He looked at the house, at the walls rising from the foundation stones, looked at the ridge where Mary's cross stood black against the stars. The whiskey bottle sat by the fire. John picked it up and threw it hard as he could. It hit a rock and shattered, the smell of alcohol sharp in the night air. He didn't sleep that night, just sat and watched the fire burn down to ash, thinking about banks and promises and wolves. John spent 2 days working on the house alone. The walls went up slower without Elias, but they went up straighter. He checked every board twice, drove every nail flush, kept his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander to what might be happening in Bentwood come Saturday. On the third morning, he woke before dawn and knew he couldn't let it stand. He saddled the gray and rode out without breakfast. The horse remembered the road to town, followed it at an easy lope through the sage flats and down into the basin where Bentwood sat waiting for the sun. John came in past the tannery just as light broke over the eastern hills. The town was quiet. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but the streets were empty. He tied the gray at the rail outside Rosa's and went in through the back door. Rosa was up, sweeping the floor. She looked at him and set the broom down. "You're here early," she said. "Need to talk to the marshal. He's still sleeping. Won't be up for another hour at least." She walked behind the bar and poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long. "What's this about? You know a man named Elias Pritchard?" Rosa thought about it. "Young, good-looking, dark hair. That's him. He's been coming in here the last few weeks, drinks whiskey, asks questions about people." She handed John the coffee. "Why?" "He's planning to rob the bank." Rosa's face didn't change, but her hand tightened on the bar. "When?" "Saturday morning before dawn. That's 2 days from now." "I know it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You part of this?" "No, but you knew about it." "He told me 3 nights ago. I sent him away." Rosa walked to the front window and looked out at the empty street. "You tell anyone else?" "You're the first. Why come to me and not the marshal direct?" John drank the coffee. It tasted burned. "Because the marshal's a drunk and I need somebody who will listen before they start asking questions I do not want to answer." "What kind of questions?" "The kind about why a man like Elias Pritchard was working on my homestead for 2 weeks." Rosa turned from the window. "Was he working or was he watching?" "Both, probably." "And you didn't know?" "Not until he told me his plan." She crossed her arms. "You're asking me to trust that." "I'm not asking nothing. I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your choice." Rosa walked back to the bar and poured herself coffee. She drank it standing, looking at John over the rim of the cup. "The bank's got near $10,000 in it right now. Mine payroll came in yesterday." "That's more than Elias said." "Then his information's good. That money goes out Monday morning to pay the workers." She set the cup down. "If that payroll don't arrive, the mine's shut down. Half this town starves." John hadn't thought about that part. "All the more reason to stop it." "How? You going to sit in the bank with a rifle and wait?" "If I have to." "The marshal won't allow it. He'll say you're stirring up trouble based on something a man told you 3 days ago. Might even think you're planning to rob it yourself and this is some kind of trick." "Then what do you suggest?" Rosa leaned on the bar. "I suggest you go wake up the marshal right now and tell him everything. Let him decide what to do. He'll want to know where I fit in all this." "You do fit in. You brought a snake into town without meaning to, and now you're trying to chase it back out." She pointed at him. "That's the truth, ain't it?" "Near enough." "Then tell it that way. Marshal Teague might be a drunk, but he ain't stupid." She picked up her broom. "And if Pritchard shows up tomorrow night, the marshal will be ready." John finished his coffee and set the cup on the bar. "What if Elias don't come? What if he changed his mind?" "Did he seem like the type to change his mind?" "No. Then he'll come." Rosa started sweeping again. You did the right thing, John. Coming here. Warning us. Don't feel right. It never does. But that don't make it wrong. John walked to the door, then stopped. You still got that shotgun under the bar? I do. Keep it loaded. He went out the back way and walked down the alley to the marshal's office. The door was locked. John knocked hard enough to rattle the frame. Waited. Knocked again. A voice came from inside, thick with sleep. Go away. Need to talk to you, Marshal. Come back at a decent hour. This can't wait. Footsteps, then the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door opened, and Marshal Teague stood there in his undershirt and pants, suspenders hanging loose. He was 50, gray-haired, with broken veins across his nose that spoke to his fondness for whiskey. John Gantry, Teague said. Heard you were back. Can I come in? Teague looked past him down the alley, then stepped aside. Make it quick. The office smelled like stale tobacco and unwashed clothes. A cot sat in the corner with blankets thrown back. Teague went to his desk and lit a lamp, then sat down and looked at John with red-rimmed eyes. Well, John told him. Everything Elias had said. The plan, the timing. Teague listened without interrupting, his face getting harder as the story went on. This Pritchard, Teague said when John finished. He worked on your place? 2 weeks. And you didn't know he was planning this? Not until he told me. Why'd he tell you? Wanted me to help him. Teague leaned back in his chair. And you said no. I did. Then rode here to warn us. That's right. Teague rubbed his face with both hands. You know how this looks? I do. You know what people will say? That John Gantry brought an outlaw to town. That maybe you two had a falling out over the split. I know it. But you came anyway. Couldn't let it happen. Teague stood up and walked to the gun rack on the wall. He took down a shotgun and checked the loads. You carrying? No. Why not? Didn't seem right. Coming here to warn you about violence while wearing guns. Teague looked at him, then nodded. All right. I believe you. Just like that? Just like that. Teague set the shotgun on his desk. I've known men like you, John. Men who tried to walk away from what they were. Most of them can't do it. But the ones who can. He shook his head. They'll do damn near anything to keep from going back. John felt something loosen in his chest. What do you need from me? I need you to go home. Stay there. Let me handle this. What if Elias comes at me first? What if he figures I warned you? Then defend yourself, but don't come back to town until this is done. Teague picked up the shotgun. I'll deputize some men. Watch the bank Friday night through Saturday morning. If Pritchard shows, we'll take him. John walked to the door. He's smart, Marshal, and he's mean. I've dealt with smart and mean before. Not like this, you haven't. Teague looked at him. You saying I can't handle one young outlaw? I'm saying don't underestimate him. John opened the door. And Marshal? He might not be alone. He mention others? No. But a man doesn't plan something like this without backup. Teague nodded. I'll keep that in mind. John walked back to where the gray was tied. The sun had cleared the hills now and the town was waking up. A freight wagon rattled past on the main street. Somebody was opening the mercantile, propping the door wide. He swung into the saddle and turned the gray toward home. He'd done what he could. Warned the marshal, given him time to prepare. Now all he could do was wait and hope Teague was as capable as he claimed. But riding out of town, John felt a cold weight in his gut that had nothing to do with the burned coffee. He'd seen Elias's eyes when he talked about the bank, seen the way he smiled when he mentioned empires. A man like that didn't scare easy, and he damn sure didn't give up. John heard the gunfire 2 miles out. 3 shots, close together, then a pause. Then 2 more. The gray's ears went forward, and the horse tried to slow, but John kicked it on. He'd been riding since before dawn, couldn't say why exactly. Just woke up knowing something was wrong. He came over the rise and saw smoke hanging over Bentwood. Not house fire smoke. Gun smoke, thick and gray in the morning air. The gray stretched out into a run and John let it go. The main street was chaos. People stood in doorways, some crying, some just staring. A woman sat on the boardwalk outside the mercantile with her apron over her face. John pulled up in front of the bank and swung down before the gray had stopped moving. The bank's front door stood open. Glass from the windows lay scattered on the boardwalk. John went inside and stopped. Samuel Hendricks lay behind the counter in a spreading pool of blood. The banker's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. He'd been shot twice in the chest. His hand still gripped the edge of the counter like he'd been trying to pull himself up when he died. "Don't touch nothing." John turned. A young man stood in the doorway, maybe 23, wearing a deputy's star that looked new. He had a pistol in his hand, pointed at John's chest. "I'm not here to rob it," John said. "I know who you are." The deputy came inside but kept the gun aimed. "You're John Gantry. The marshal told me about you yesterday." "Where's Teague?" "In the street." The deputy's voice cracked. "He's dead." John pushed past him and went back outside. A crowd had gathered in front of the marshal's office. John shouldered through them and saw Teague lying face down in the dirt, 3 bullet holes in his back. His shotgun lay 5 feet away, both barrels fired. Silas knelt beside the body. He looked up when John approached. "They shot him from behind." "Who did?" "Don't know. It was still dark. Teague was crossing the street toward the bank when somebody opened up on him from the alley." Silas pointed. "He got 2 shots off before he went down." John looked at the alley, saw blood in the dirt leading away into the shadows. "Somebody's hit," Silas said. "Trail leads out the back way." The deputy had followed John out. "We need to form a posse. Track them down." "How many were there?" John asked. 3, maybe 4. It happened fast." The deputy looked at the marshal's body. "Teague deputized 6 of us last night. We were supposed to watch the bank in shifts, but they came earlier than we expected." "What time?" "Just before dawn. The second shift was supposed to take over at 5. They hit at 4:30. The deputy holstered his gun. "The vault's empty. They took everything." John walked to the bank and looked at the back wall. A hole big enough to climb through had been smashed in the brick. Tools lay scattered on the ground, sledgehammers, pry bars. They'd worked fast and brutal. Rosa came out of the saloon carrying a blanket. She walked to where Teague lay and spread it over him. When she stood up, she saw John. "You warned him," she said. "I did." "Wasn't enough." She looked at the covered body. "They knew he'd be here. Knew exactly where to hit him." "How would they know that?" "Same way they knew which wall was weakest. Same way they knew when the payroll was here." Rosa looked at John. "Somebody told them. Somebody in this town." The deputy came over. "Miss Rosa, you can't go spreading accusations." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact. They had information we didn't give them." She pointed at the hole in the wall. "That's the oldest part of the bank. The bricks there are 50 years old, weakest spot in the building. Nobody knows that except people who've been here a long time." "Maybe they got lucky," the deputy said. "Men like that don't rely on luck." Rosa looked at John. "Your friend Pritchard. He spent 2 weeks asking questions around town. Who did he talk to?" "I don't know. I wasn't with him." "But he was here on your account, working on your place." John felt the crowd shift. People who'd been looking at the marshal's body were now looking at him. The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. "I warned Teague 2 days ago," John said. "Came here myself and told him Elias was planning this." "So you say." The deputy stepped closer. "But all we know for sure is you brought an outlaw to town and now our marshal's dead and the bank's robbed." Silas stood up. "John wouldn't do this." "How do you know?" The deputy looked at the crowd. Any of you know for certain John Gantry wasn't part of this? That him and Pritchard didn't have a falling out over the split? That's a damn lie, Silas said. Is it? The deputy turned back to John. Where were you this morning? My homestead. Anybody see you there? No. Convenient. The deputy pulled his gun again. I think you better come with me until we sort this out. I'm not under arrest. No, but you're a person of interest, and I'm asking you peaceful-like to come to the office so we can talk. John looked at the deputy's face, saw fear there and anger and ambition. A young man trying to make his mark in front of a town that just lost its marshal. All right, John said. I'll come. John, you don't have to do this, Silas said. I know. John looked at Rosa. Get word to anyone who saw Elias in town. Find out who he talked to, what he asked about. I'm not sure that's your concern anymore, the deputy said. He gestured with the pistol. Let's go. They walked to the marshal's office. The deputy made John sit in a chair while he paced back and forth. Through the window, John could see people moving Teague's body, could hear someone hammering boards over the hole in the bank's wall. Tell me again about Pritchard, the deputy said. So John told him. Everything from the beginning. How Elias showed up on the road, how they worked together, how Elias revealed his plan. The deputy listened with his arms crossed. And you just sent him away? The deputy asked when John finished. I did. Didn't try to stop him? Didn't even consider going to the law until 2 days later? I came as soon as I decided it was right. 2 weeks you worked with a man planning to rob this town and you didn't suspect nothing? No. The deputy shook his head. I don't believe you. That's your choice. My choice is to hold you until we find Pritchard and get his side of the story. On what charge? Suspicion of conspiracy, aiding an outlaw. Take your pick. The deputy walked to the door. You'll stay here while I organize a posse. If you're innocent like you claim, sitting in that chair won't hurt you none. He went out and closed the door. John heard a key turn in the lock. He sat in the chair and looked at the empty gun rack on the wall, looked at Teague's desk with papers scattered across it, looked at the blood stain on the floor where the marshal had stood just yesterday morning, listening to John's warning. Outside, someone was shouting orders about forming a posse. Horses moved past the window. John closed his eyes and saw Elias's face the night he left, the way he'd smiled when he talked about empires. He'd tried to do the right thing, tried to warn them, tried to stop it without violence, and it hadn't been enough. It never was. The key turning in the lock was a final, grating sound. John sat in the marshal's chair, the leather cracked and smelling of Teague's stale tobacco, and listened to the town try to put itself back together. He heard the hammer, a slow, clumsy rhythm, as someone nailed boards over the hole in the bank's wall. He heard the high, thin sound of a woman crying, a sound that came and went on the breeze. The deputy, Reed, had left him there. A man trying to wear a hat that was too big for him. His fear and ambition a dangerous combination. John wasn't a prisoner. He was a problem the deputy didn't know how to solve yet. An hour passed. The hammering stopped. The crying stopped. The silence that fell was worse. It was a silence full of watching eyes. The door rattled. The key turned again and the door opened. It was Rosa, her face set in hard lines. Silas, the corral owner, stood behind her, his big hands looking useless at his sides. He had no right, Rosa said, stepping into the office. She put a tin plate of biscuits and a cup of coffee on the corner of Teague's desk. Locking you up? He's scared, John said. He didn't touch the food. A scared man with a new badge is a dangerous thing. Silas stood in the doorway, blocking the light. The whole town's scared, John. They found the banker's clerk, young Miller, tied up in the back room. He said there were 4 of them. Said one of them was your man. Elias. He's not my man, John said. They don't see it that way, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. They see a stranger you brought here. They see a dead marshal. The deputy, Reed, came back in, his face flushed. He'd been talking to the posse, trying to sound like he was in charge. He saw Rosa and Silas, and his jaw tightened. "This is official business. I'll ask you to leave." "I brought him breakfast," Rosa said, her voice flat. She didn't move. "Even a man you're accusing of murder gets to eat." "I haven't accused him of anything," Reed said, his eyes avoiding John's. "I'm holding him for his own protection, until this is sorted out." "You're holding him because you don't know what else to do," Rosa shot back. "And because it makes you look like you were doing something in front of the town council." She leaned on the desk, her knuckles white. "I did what you asked, John. I asked questions." John looked at her. "And?" "Elias talked to a lot of people, but he spent 2 evenings drinking with Samuel Hendricks's brother-in-law, a man named Finch who lost his freight business last year when the bank called in his loan." Reed scoffed. "Finch? He's a drunk. Spends all day complaining at the saloon." "A drunk with a grudge is still a man with a grudge," Rosa said. "And he knows every secret that bank ever had. He used to haul their payroll." She looked straight at the deputy. "Did you ask Miller what the other men looked like? The ones who weren't Elias?" Reed's face went blank. "He said they had masks on." "Did you ask him if one of them was a big man with a busted hand who limped when he walked?" The deputy's mouth opened, then closed. "Because Finch's old partner, a man named Cole, fits that description," Rosa said, pressing the point. "And he's been missing for 2 days." John looked at the new deputy. He saw a young man in over his head, a man who had been so focused on the obvious target, the stranger, that he hadn't bothered to look at the ground beneath his own feet. "You don't have anything to hold him on," Silas said, his voice a quiet threat. "You've got a rumor from a drunk sister-in-law and a whole lot of suspicion. That ain't the law." Reed's face hardened, the flush of embarrassment turning to anger. "I'm the law in this town now. I say who stays and who goes." "Then you'd better start making the right choices," John said, speaking for the first time. He stood up. He was taller than the deputy, and the weeks of hard labor had put a thickness back in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "You can keep me in this chair while the trail goes cold. You can lead a posse of scared townsfolk on a wild goose chase. Or you can unlock that door and let me do what you can't." "And what's that?" Reed sneered. "Find him," John said. "Elias isn't running for the border. He's running toward something. A man like that, with that much money, he's not going to hide. He's going to build. You want to stop him, you have to get to him before he lays his foundation." The office was silent. Rosa and Silas watched the 2 men, the Old West and the New, facing each other over a dead man's desk. Reed looked at the anger in John's eyes, the quiet certainty. He looked at the faces of Rosa and Silas, respected people who were standing with the accused. He looked at the empty gun rack on the wall. He was out of moves. He walked to the door and unlocked it. He didn't look at John. "You're not deputized," Reed said, his voice stiff. "You're not acting for this town. You're on your own." "I always am," John said. He walked past the deputy without another word. Silas followed him out. Rosa stayed behind, a silent guardian watching the young lawman. John stepped out into the morning light. The townsfolk who had been gathered in the street went quiet, their conversations dying as they turned to watch him. Their faces were a mixture of fear, suspicion, and a faint, desperate flicker of hope. They didn't know if he was the cause of their trouble or the cure. John didn't care. He walked toward the livery, his stride long and purposeful. He had tried peace. He had tried words. They had left him with a dead marshal and a town in chaos. He knew what he had to do now. He had to go home and dig up his ghosts. The ride home was a silent argument with a ghost. John kept the gray at a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes on the horizon, but his mind was back in Bentwood. He saw Teague's body under the blanket. He saw the dark, spreading stain on the bank's floorboards. He had tried to use words, a warning. The response had been gunfire and death. A promise made to a dead woman was a poor shield against men like Elias. He reached the homestead as the sun climbed high, beating down on the half-built house. The pine frame, which had seemed a symbol of a new start yesterday, now looked like a skeleton, a monument to a fool's hope. The place was silent. No birds sang. The air was heavy and still. He didn't unsaddle the horse. He swung down, his movements stiff, and walked not to the house, but to the barn, or what was left of it. The fire had burned hot, leaving only a few charred timbers and the stone foundation, a black, ugly scar on the land. He walked to the back corner, a place where a hayrick had once stood, and stopped. He looked at the packed, fire-hardened earth. He had buried them deep, buried the man he had been, right along with the tools of his trade. He found the shovel he and Elias had been using, its blade still clean, and walked back to the barn ruin. He drove the blade into the ground. The earth was hard, resistant. He put his boot on the shovel's shoulder and threw his full weight into it. The ground gave with a low, grudging sound. He worked with a steady, punishing rhythm, the scrape of the shovel, the grunt of his breath, the soft thud of dirt on the growing pile. Sweat ran down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop to wipe it away. He was digging a grave in reverse. Each shovelful of dirt was an admission. Each motion, a surrender to the man he had tried to kill and bury inside himself. An hour passed. The sun beat on his back. His hands, calloused from the house building, were raw again. He didn't feel it. He was focused on the hole, on what lay at the bottom. The shovel hit something that wasn't rock, a soft, yielding thud. He knelt and dug the last few inches with his bare hands, the dirt cool and fine against his skin. He felt the familiar shape of the oilcloth bundle. He pulled it free. It was heavy, dense with the weight of consequence. He carried the bundle to the well and set it on the flat stone cover. He untied the leather thong that bound it. The oilcloth, still slick and smelling of preservative, unrolled with a soft, whispering sound. The two Colts lay nested inside, their blued steel a dull, menacing black. They were clean, cared for, sleeping predators. He picked one up. The weight was a shock, a memory that ran up his arm and settled deep in his chest. It felt like an anchor. It felt like coming home. He took the gun belt from the bundle. The leather was supple, dark with sweat and use. The cartridges in the loops were brassy and clean. He sat on the well cover and began the ritual. He broke the first revolver down, the clicks of the cylinder and the hammer loud in the silence. He took a small flask of oil and a clean rag from the bundle and began to wipe down each piece. The smell of the gun oil, sharp and metallic, was the scent of his old life. He worked with a practiced, detached efficiency. There was no pleasure in it, no anger, just a grim, final acceptance. He finished with the first gun and started on the second. When both were reassembled, their actions smooth and deadly, he loaded them, pushing each heavy cartridge into its chamber. The solid final click of the loading gate was the sound of a door closing on the man who had hammered nails and dreamed of a quiet season. He stood up. He slung the gun belt around his hips and buckled it. The weight on his hips was familiar, a burden he had thought he'd shed forever. It settled on him, not as a choice, but as a judgment. He walked to the gray, which stood waiting patiently, its reins trailing in the dust. He checked the rifle in its scabbard, then swung into the saddle. He didn't look back at the half-built house. It belonged to a different man, a man who was now as much a ghost as the woman buried on the ridge. He turned the horse north, toward the lawless territories, toward a young man who smiled when he talked about empires. The trail was an insult. John cut the sign a mile north of Bentwood, where the churned-up mud of the posse's failed search gave way to a clear, hard-packed road. 4 horses moving at a steady walk, not a run, not even a trot. They weren't running from anything. He followed, keeping the gray to the high ground, a silhouette against the endless sky. The trail told a story, and John read it line by line. Elias hadn't fled south for the border. the rabbits run for Mexico. He had turned north, a straight, unwavering line toward the jagged peaks of the San Juan Range, toward the mining territories where the only law was the color of a man's gold. The tracks were deep, confident. The horses were shod, one of them favoring its left foreleg. Teague's shotgun blast had found a home, but the stride was even. They weren't pushing the animal, they were taking their time. He found their first camp at dusk, tucked into a dry arroyo that offered shelter from the wind. It wasn't the camp of men on the run. The fire had been built in a neat ring of stones, not a frantic blaze. He found the empty tins of canned peaches, a luxury. He found a discarded bandage stained with blood. They had taken the time to tend to their wounded. They had eaten well and slept warm. They believed they had all the time in the world. John didn't make a fire. He ate cold jerky and drank from his canteen, his back against a rock, his eyes scanning the dark, empty horizon. He thought of Elias's smile, the easy charm that hid the cold calculation beneath. The robbery wasn't the end of the plan. It was the beginning. The $10,000 wasn't a score. It was a grubstake. He was on the trail by dawn, the air cold and sharp. The country began to change, the flat sagebrush plains giving way to rolling foothills and canyons of red rock. The trail never wavered. It followed the easiest grade, the most direct route. It was the trail of a man who had studied a map, who knew exactly where he was going. Late in the afternoon, he saw a building, a long, low adobe structure with a sod roof, a remote trading post squatting in the shadow of a mesa. A curl of smoke rose from its chimney. 4 horses were tied to the hitching rail out front. John reined in the gray a quarter-mile out, watching the post from a rise. He saw a man come out, stretch, and throw a bucket of dirty water into the dust. The man wore a pistol, but he moved like a storekeeper, not a gunman. John rode down. The horses at the rail were lathered, tired, not Elias's. These belonged to prospectors, their saddles laden with picks and bedrolls. He dismounted and walked inside. The place smelled of dust, leather, and cheap whiskey. The storekeeper, a man with a bald head and a worried face, was measuring out flour for a miner with a long gray beard. "Help you?" the storekeeper asked without looking up. "Coffee," John said, "and grain for my horse." The storekeeper finished with the miner, who paid with a pinch of gold dust from a leather pouch, and turned to John. His eyes took in the twin Colts on John's hips, the hard lines on his face. The worry in his expression deepened. "Coffee's a nickel, grain's extra." John put a coin on the rough-hewn counter. The storekeeper filled a cup from a pot on the stove. It was hot, and it wasn't burned. "See a group of 4 riders pass this way?" John asked. "Yesterday, maybe." The storekeeper's hands paused as he was scooping grain into a sack. "Might have. See a lot of riders." This group was different. One of them, young, dark hair, a talker. The storekeeper's face went blank. It was a careful, practiced kind of blank. "Can't say I recall." John took a slow sip of the coffee. He looked around the small store. Shelves were half empty. The barrel of pickles was low. "Business slow?" "It's the syndicate," the storekeeper said, his voice dropping. "They've been squeezing the camps, buying up the claims for pennies on the dollar. Men are scared to sell their dust to anyone but them." He looked at John, a flicker of something, hope, maybe fear, in his eyes. "You law?" "No." "Then you're either with them or you're in their way." "I'm just a man looking for another man," John said. He finished his coffee and laid another coin on the counter for the grain. "This group I'm looking for." One of their horses was limping. The storekeeper's eyes darted toward the door, then back to John. He leaned forward, his voice a low whisper. "They were here. Yesterday. The young one. The leader. He bought 2 new horses. Paid in cash. Said he was tired of his lame stock slowing him down." "Which way did they go?" "North. Toward Silver Creek." The storekeeper straightened up, his face blank again, as another miner walked in. "Anything else for you?" "No," John said. "That'll be all." He took the sack of grain and walked out into the bright, hard sunlight. He fed the gray, letting the horse drink from the trough. He had what he needed. Elias hadn't just restocked, he had upgraded. He was shedding any weakness, erasing his trail, moving with a purpose that was colder and clearer than simple greed. Silver Creek. It wasn't a town. It was a sprawling, lawless mining camp, a place where a man with $10,000 in stolen money could buy more than horses. He could buy men. He could buy power. Silver Creek was a wound in the earth. It wasn't a town. It was a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, slapdash lean-tos, and a few raw timber buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a week. The single muddy street was a river of noise and desperation. The air smelled of pine sawdust, unwashed men, and the metallic tang of the ore being pulled from the guts of the surrounding hills. Elias Sterling rode in at the head of a four-man column, his horse picking its way through the ruts and the debris. They were clean, their gear new, their animals fresh. They looked like they belonged in a different world. A crowd was gathered in the center of the camp, a tight, silent circle of 50 men. They weren't watching a dogfight or a card game. In the center of the circle, a man stood on the bed of a freight wagon, a rope around his neck. The other end of the rope was thrown over the thick branch of a dead pine tree. The man on the wagon was wiry, with a hawk nose and eyes that darted over the crowd, not with fear, but with a kind of black, cynical amusement. He'd been in this kind of jackpot before. A big man in a dusty derby hat stood on the wagon beside him, holding the loose end of the rope. He had a tin star pinned to his vest, but it was crooked, and he wore it like an afterthought. He was syndicate. "Cale Jansen," the man in the derby hat announced, his voice a bullfrog's croak. "Found guilty of high-grading Mr. Corbin's claim. The penalty for theft in this camp is death." Nobody in the crowd moved. They had seen this before. It wasn't justice. It was business. Elias reined in his horse at the edge of the circle. He didn't dismount. He just watched, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Any last words, Cale?" the derby man asked. Cale looked at him, a slow, lazy grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, you're standing on my foot." The derby man's face flushed. He kicked Cale's leg hard. Cale stumbled but didn't fall. The grin never left his face. "Ask him how much he stole," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence. Every head in the crowd turned to look at him. The man in the derby hat squinted, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "This ain't your concern, stranger." "It is now," Elias said. He nudged his horse forward, the crowd parting for him as if he were Moses and they were the sea. He stopped 10 feet from the wagon. "A man's life is worth something. I'm asking you the price." The derby man looked from Elias to the two hard-faced men who sat their horses behind him. He saw the new rifles, the confident way they held themselves. "The price is justice." "Justice has a number," Elias said. "Everything does." He looked at Cale. "You steal from Mr. Corbin?" "I borrowed a few rocks," Cale said, his amused eyes on Elias. "He's got a whole mountain of them. I figured he wouldn't mind." Elias turned back to the man in the derby. "How much was he borrowing?" The man hesitated. This wasn't part of the script. $200 worth. Maybe more. "That's a lot of borrowing," Elias said. He reached into the saddlebag that had been bought with Samuel Hendricks's money. He pulled out a thick, tight roll of bills. He peeled off several and held them up. The men in the crowd, who worked all week for a handful of coins, stared at the cash, their eyes wide. "Here's 300, Elias said, 200 to cover the loan, and another 100 for your trouble." He tossed the bills onto the wagon bed. They landed in a soft pile at the derby man's feet. "Now take the rope off his neck." The derby man stared at the money. then at Elias. He was a man caught in a trap he didn't understand. To refuse the money was to admit the hanging wasn't about theft, it was about power. To take it was to admit his justice could be bought. He took it. He bent down, scooped up the bills, and stuffed them in his pocket. He looked at Cale with pure hatred. "Get down." He untied the rope. Cale rubbed his neck. He hopped down from the wagon, his movements easy, not like a man who had just been seconds from death. He walked straight to Elias's horse and looked up at him. "You just bought the most expensive horse thief in the territory," Cale said. "I wasn't buying a horse thief," Elias said, looking down at him. "I was hiring a professional." He gestured to one of his men, who dismounted and handed the reins of his horse to Cale. "You ride with me now." Cale's cynical grin faded, replaced by a look of sharp, dawning understanding. He wasn't being saved, he was being recruited. He saw the ambition in Elias's eyes, the cold fire. He saw a man who didn't just spend money, but invested it. "Doing what?" Cale asked. "We're going to have a talk with Mr. Corbin," Elias said, "about interest rates." He looked out over the crowd of silent, watching miners. "And then we're going to have a talk with all of you about a new way of doing business in Silver Creek." He turned his horse and rode through the crowd, which parted for him again. Cale swung into the saddle of his new horse and fell in beside him, followed by the others. They rode down the muddy street, 5 men now, an army of their own. The miners watched them go, a new and dangerous idea beginning to flicker in their tired, desperate eyes. Hope. The water gave out at noon. The sun was a white fire in a bleached-out sky, and the land had turned mean, a broken country of shale and sun-scorched rock where nothing grew but stunted juniper and heat shimmer. The gray horse was slick with sweat, its head low, its breathing a harsh, ragged sound. John dismounted and walked, the leather of his boots hot enough to cook on. He saw the smoke by accident. A thin, gray thread rising against a backdrop of red rock, so faint he thought it was a trick of the heat at first. Smoke meant a fire. A fire meant people. He left the gray in a shallow draw and went the last quarter-mile on foot, moving with a hunter's quiet, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. The cabin was small, built of sod and river stone, tucked into the protective shadow of a granite bluff. A good spot. Defensible. It had a well-tended look. Someone had planted a row of hardy-looking vegetables in a small, fenced plot. A woman was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a lone cottonwood tree. She moved with a tired, efficient grace. John stopped behind a cluster of boulders 100 yards out and watched them. It was a world he had once known. The thought was a dull ache in his chest, a ghost limb he'd forgotten he had. He stepped out from behind the rocks. The woman saw him instantly. She didn't scream or run. She dropped the piece of laundry she was holding and moved fast and smooth into the cabin. A moment later, she was back, a long-barreled Spencer rifle in her hands. John stopped in the open, his hands in plain sight away from his guns. "That's far enough," the woman called out. Her voice was steady. "Ma'am," John said, his own voice a dry rasp. "I'm not looking for trouble. My horse is dry. I was hoping to buy some water." She didn't lower the rifle. The Spencer was a heavy gun, but she held it like she knew how to use it. "We don't get many visitors out this way. The ones we do are usually lost or running." "A little of both," John said. He stood there under the hammer of the sun and let her look at him. Let her see the trail dust, the exhaustion, the guns on his hips that were not for show. The boy whispered something to her. She shook her head, a small, sharp motion. "Just water," John said again. "I'll pay for it." She was quiet for a long time. She was measuring him, weighing the risk. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "The well's over there. You can use the dipper, but you stay where I can see you." "Thank you, ma'am." He walked to the well, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He could feel her eyes on his back, the rifle a silent weight between them. He worked the crank, the rope creaking in the silence, and brought up a bucket of clear, cold water. He drank from the dipper, letting the water run down his chin, washing the dust from his throat. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He refilled his canteen, then walked to where he had left the gray and brought the horse back to the trough. The animal drank greedily, its sides heaving. The boy had come off the porch. He stood a few feet away from the woman, his curiosity overriding his fear. He was a thin boy with his mother's serious eyes. "That's a good horse," the boy said. "He is," John said, not looking at him, his hands busy with the horse's reins. "Is he fast?" "Fast enough." "My pa had a fast horse," the boy said. "A big roan. He said it could outrun the devil himself." The woman's voice was sharp. "Daniel, go inside." The boy looked at his mother, then back at John, a question in his eyes. John turned. He looked at the boy, at the small, carved piece of wood still clutched in his hand. He saw a life he had almost had, a ghost of a son he had never known. The ache in his chest was a sharp, physical pain now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. He walked to the porch and set the silver dollar on the top step. "For the water." The woman watched him, the rifle still held at a low ready. "That's too much." "No," John said. "It's not." He turned and walked back to the gray, his movements stiff. He swung into the saddle. He looked at the small, defiant fortress they had built in the middle of nowhere. A woman and a boy holding on. He thought of Elias, building his own kind of fortress, a kingdom bought with blood and ambition. He knew with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity which one was worth defending. He rode out without looking back, the echo of the boy's voice following him. He was no longer just a man hunting a thief. He was a man with a debt to a ghost, and the payment was due in Silver Creek. The largest saloon in Silver Creek was called the Gilded Cage, but there was nothing gilded about it. It was a long, smoke-choked room built of raw pine, the floor a mix of sawdust and mud. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and the damp wool of unwashed miners. A man played a tuneless song on a piano in the corner, his fingers hitting the keys with a tired, mechanical rhythm. John stood at the bat-wing doors for a full minute, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, letting the noise wash over him. He wasn't looking for a drink. He was looking for a man who had been bought. He saw him at a table in the back, surrounded by 3 other men, Kyle Jansen. He was telling a story, his hands moving, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. He wore his new status like a fresh-pressed suit, laughing too loud, his eyes shining with the arrogance of a man who had looked down the barrel of a rope and walked away. John moved to the bar. He didn't order a drink. He leaned against the sticky wood and watched the reflection of Cale's table in the dusty mirror behind the bar. "You're a lucky man, Cale," one of the miners said, his voice slurred. "That new fella Elias, he just rides in and buys your life like it was a sack of potatoes." "It ain't luck," Cale said, pouring himself another drink. "It's an investment. A man like Mr. Sterling, he recognizes talent when he sees it." He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the butt of a new-looking pistol tied low on his hip. "He's changing things here. No more syndicate leeches. A man gets a fair price for his dust now. All he asks in return is a little loyalty." John pushed himself off the bar and walked toward the table. He moved without hurry, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds on the floorboards. The men at the table went quiet as he approached. Cale looked up, his story interrupted, his eyes full of annoyance. "This is a private table," Cale said. John stopped beside the chair opposite him. "I'm looking for Elias Sterling." Cale's easy arrogance sharpened into a guarded suspicion. "Who's asking?" "A man he owes a debt to," John said. Cale's chair scraped as he pushed it back. He stood up slowly. He was a few inches shorter than John, but wiry and quick. "Mr. Sterling doesn't owe anybody anything. He's the one who does the paying." He looked John up and down, taking in the trail dust and the twin Colts. You got business with him. You talk to me first. My business is with him, John said, his voice quiet. But the message is for you. I ain't your delivery boy, Cale sneered. He moved his hand, letting it hover over the grip of his pistol. It was a practiced, showy gesture, meant for the audience that was now watching from the surrounding tables. That's a nice gun, John said. Looks new. It is, Cale said, a grin touching his lips. And it's fast. He drew. He was fast. The pistol cleared the leather in a blur of motion, but it never leveled. John's hand moved with a speed that was not a blur. It was a single, economical motion. His own revolver was in his hand, the hammer already back. The barrel came up and slammed down hard on the bones of Cale's wrist. The sound was a sharp, wet crack. Cale screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, shocked pain. His pistol clattered to the floor. He stumbled back, clutching his right hand to his chest, his face white, his eyes wide with disbelief. His gun hand was a broken, useless thing, bent at an angle it wasn't meant to have. John didn't look at the gun on the floor. He didn't look at the crowd that had gone dead silent. He took a step forward, his revolver now pressed against the buckle of Cale's belt. You tell him, John said, his voice a low, cold whisper that cut through the silence. The debt is his. He held Cale's eyes for a long, hard second. He saw the arrogance replaced by a raw animal fear. He saw the understanding. John stepped back, holstered his revolver, and turned. The crowd parted for him, a silent, staring sea of faces. He walked the length of the saloon, his boots the only sound in the room. He pushed through the batwing doors and stepped out into the muddy street, leaving the man Elias had bought writhing on the floor, a crippled, whimpering message that would be delivered before the sun went down. The building had belonged to the Corbin Syndicate. It was the only structure in Silver Creek made of milled lumber instead of raw logs, and it had a real glass window. Elias Sterling sat behind the heavy oak desk that had belonged to Corbin's chief enforcer, a man who had left town in a hurry 3 days ago, leaving his paperwork and a half-full bottle of whiskey behind. Elias wasn't drinking. He was working. A line of miners stood outside the open door, their hats in their hands, waiting their turn. They didn't have the sullen, beaten-down look of the men John had seen in the saloon. They looked tired, but they looked like men who had a stake in their own lives. One by one they came in, a grizzled prospector with a leather pouch of dust. Elias weighed on a set of brass scales, did the math on a piece of scratch paper, and paid the man in cash from a lockbox on the desk. The price was fair. The miner nodded, a look of grudging wonder on his face, and left. Next was a young man with a dispute over a claim marker. Elias listened, asked 2 sharp questions, and made a judgment that was swift and final. The young man left, satisfied. This was the empire. Not a throne and a crown, but a desk, a set of scales, and the absolute certainty of a man who understood that power wasn't taken with a gun. It was given in exchange for order. The door darkened. 2 of Elias's men, the ones who had been with him in the saloon, came in. They were half-carrying, half-dragging Kyle Jansen between them. Cale's face was the color of old tallow, beaded with sweat. He held his right hand cradled to his chest. It was already swollen, a grotesque purple claw. Elias looked up from his paperwork. His expression didn't change. He showed no surprise, no anger. He looked at Cale's hand with the detached curiosity of a rancher examining a lame horse. Set him down, Elias said. They put Cale in the chair opposite the desk. He slumped into it, his breathing shallow and ragged. The line of miners outside shuffled their feet, trying to see, before one of Elias's men quietly closed the door. What happened? Elias asked. His voice was calm, conversational. A man, Cale rasped, his eyes bright with pain and humiliation. He came into the gilded cage, asked for you. And you obliged him with a conversation? He said you owed him a debt, Cale gritted out. I told him you don't owe nobody. I told him to talk to me. And did he? Cale looked down at his broken hand. Yeah, he talked. Elias leaned back in the big oak chair. It was Corbin's chair. It suited him. What did he look like? Big, Cale said. Quiet. Wore 2 guns. Looked like he'd been dragged behind a horse for a week. Elias's face remained a polite, interested mask, but a flicker of something, recognition, almost amusement, danced in his eyes. And what was the message? Besides that, he gestured with his chin toward Cale's hand. He said to tell you, Cale whispered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. The debt is his. The room was silent for a long moment. Elias looked at the closed door, a faint, thoughtful smile touching his lips. He wasn't looking at Cale anymore. He was looking at a chessboard, at a piece that had just made an unexpected, elegant move. One of the men by the door, a hard case named Miller, shifted his weight. You want us to go after him, boss? We can track him down before he gets 5 miles. Elias shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. No, you wouldn't find him, and if you did, he'd send you back in worse shape than Cale. He looked back at Cale, his expression softening into something that might have been sympathy. Get him to the dock. What's left of him? Tell the dock to set the hand and that the bill is mine. Cale stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in his pain-filled eyes. He had failed. He had expected rage, dismissal. He was being offered care. Go on, Elias said gently. Miller and the other man helped Cale to his feet and led him out, a broken, shuffling testament to a debt being collected. Elias was alone. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the muddy, chaotic street that was now his. He saw the miners, his miners, moving with a new purpose. He saw the syndicate's old office, now his own. He was building something here, something real. John Gantry wasn't a problem. He wasn't a threat. He was a complication, a man of principle, a ghost from a life Elias had tried to recruit and failed. And that ghost had just sent him a message written in shattered bone. He didn't see it as an act of war. He saw it as a move in a game only the 2 of them were playing. John could have killed Cale. He had chosen not to. He had chosen to be precise, to be surgical. It was a message of capability. A reminder of the man John was, and the man Elias had wanted as a partner. Elias smiled. He wasn't angry. He was challenged. He was intrigued. He walked back to the desk. He took out a fresh piece of paper and dipped a pen in the inkwell. He began to write, not a plan of attack, but a list. Names of mines, tonnage estimates, payroll figures for the men he was now protecting. He would not send men to hunt a ghost. He would do what a prince does when his kingdom is challenged. He would make it stronger. He would make it so rich, so powerful, so vital, that not even a ghost could tear it down. The game was afoot, and he was already thinking 2 moves ahead. John spent 2 days watching Silver Creek from the high ridges. He was a ghost in the rocks, a patient observer of the machine Elias was building. He watched the miners coming and going from the new assay office, their shoulders a little less slumped, their steps a little quicker. He watched Elias's men patrol the camp, not as bullies, but as guardians, their presence a promise of order in a place that had only ever known chaos. Elias was a master carpenter, and he was building his house with the town's own wood. Every fair price he paid was a nail-driven home. Every dispute he settled was another beam set in place. On the 3rd morning, John saw what he was waiting for. A dust cloud on the eastern trail, moving slow and heavy. A freight wagon flanked by 4 outriders. It wasn't supplies. It was moving with the self-important crawl of money. The Corbin Syndicate payroll. He knew its route. The storekeeper at the trading post had told him without meaning to. A weekly run to keep their dwindling number of loyal miners paid, a show of strength to pretend they still owned the territory. John wasn't on the trail. He was 2 miles ahead, where the road narrowed to a passage between a sheer rock face and a steep, wooded drop-off. He didn't build a barricade. He didn't plan an ambush. He waited, a single man sitting on a boulder in the middle of the road, his rifle resting across his lap. The lead riders saw him from 100 yards out. They pulled up, their hands going to their pistols. The wagon creaked to a halt behind them. One of the riders, a man with a heavy mustache and a nervous twitch, rode forward. "You're in the road, mister." "I know it," John said. "Then get out of it." "I'm waiting on a delivery," John said, his voice calm, carrying in the still air. The rider looked at his partners, then back at John. He saw a man with 2 Colts on his hips and a rifle that looked like it had grown out of his hands. He saw a man who wasn't scared. "This is syndicate business," the rider said, his voice a little less certain now. "That's why I'm here," John said. He stood up slowly. "I'll take the box. You and your men can ride on. No one has to get hurt." The rider laughed, a short, ugly bark. He drew his pistol. "There's 4 of us, old man." John's rifle was already at his shoulder. He didn't aim at the man. He aimed at the rock face a foot above his head. The shot was a sharp, flat crack. A spray of granite chips stung the rider's face. His horse screamed and reared, throwing him into the dust. Before the other 3 could react, a second shot came from the woods on the opposite side of the road. One of the riders grunted and slumped in his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The remaining 2 looked from John to the woods, their faces masks of panic. They were caught in a crossfire. They spurred their horses, not at John, but back the way they had come, galloping away in a cloud of dust and terror. John walked to the rider on the ground, who was groaning, his arm twisted beneath him. He picked up the man's pistol and tucked it in his belt. A figure stepped out of the woods, a rifle in his hand. It was the young deputy from Bentwood, Reed. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but he stood his ground. "You're a hard man to follow, Gantry," Reed said. "I didn't ask you to," John said, not looking at him. He walked to the wagon. The driver sat frozen on the seat, his hands held high. John motioned with his rifle. "Get down." The driver scrambled down, his eyes wide. John climbed up and found the strongbox under the seat, a heavy iron-banded chest. He threw it to the ground. It landed with a heavy thud. "The key," John said. The driver fumbled in his vest and handed it over. John opened the box. It was filled with neat stacks of currency, and something else, a thin, leather-bound ledger. He picked up the book. He opened it. Columns of names, amounts owed, amounts paid. He saw it in a single, cold glance. The syndicate was paying the miners 1/3 of what was officially recorded in the payroll. The rest was being skimmed. He looked from the book to the cash. Stealing this money wouldn't hurt Elias. It would only hurt the men who had earned it. It would make Elias, the man who paid fair, look even more like a savior. "What is it?" Reed asked, walking over. John tossed him the ledger. The deputy caught it, his eyes scanning the pages. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a look of disgust. "They're robbing them blind," Reed whispered. John closed the strongbox. He looked at the driver and the 2 wounded riders. He looked at the trail leading back toward the syndicate's main office. Then he looked north, toward Silver Creek. He had come here to disrupt an empire. Instead, he had been handed the tool to build it. He walked to the head of the wagon team and took the reins. He climbed back onto the driver's seat. "What are you doing?" Reed asked, bewildered. "Delivering the mail," John said. He snapped the reins, and the heavy wagon lurched forward, leaving the deputy and the 3 syndicate men in the dust. He drove it north, not as a thief, but as a paymaster, about to unintentionally make the Prince of Silver Creek a king. The wagon wheels screamed a protest against the hard-packed road. John kept the team at a steady, punishing pace, the heavy freight wagon lurching and swaying behind them. The stolen payroll ledger sat on the seat beside him. its leather cover warm in the afternoon sun. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't a hero. He was a delivery man, driving a tool of his enemy's success right to his front door. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He heard the horse before he saw it, the frantic, drumming rhythm of an animal being pushed to its limit. He didn't look back. He just shifted his rifle, laying it across his lap. A moment later, Deputy Reed pulled alongside the wagon, his face a mask of red dust and fury. He was riding one of the syndicate horses, a big bay, and he'd run it hard. "Pull this wagon over, Gantry!" Reed's voice was a raw shout over the noise of the wheels. "That's an order!" John didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, a dusty, wavering line that led straight to Silver Creek. "Go back to Bentwood, kid. This isn't your fight." "You robbed a payroll wagon. You're driving stolen property. That makes it my fight." Reed spurred the bay, pulling ahead and trying to cut the wagon off. The lead mule, a stubborn old beast, just pinned its ears and kept going. Reed had to swerve to avoid a collision. He fell back alongside the driver's seat. "I'm placing you under arrest." "On what charge?" John asked, his voice calm. "Returning stolen property?" He tapped the ledger with his finger. "This book says the syndicate is robbing those miners blind. The money in that box is theirs. I'm just making sure it gets there." "That's for a judge to decide, not you." Reed was practically screaming now, his face flushed with the frustration of a man whose authority was being ignored. He drew his pistol, the movement clumsy in the saddle. "I said stop the damn wagon!" John looked at him then. He saw the sweat on the boy's face, the fear in his eyes that was masquerading as anger. He saw a kid in over his head, trying to make the world fit the shape of the law he'd read in a book. "Put the gun away," John said, his voice flat. "You're going to get yourself hurt." "You're the one who's going to get hurt if you don't." The first shot came from the rocks above them, a high, sharp crack that was not from the deputy's pistol. A chunk of wood exploded from the side of the wagon, a foot from Reed's head. The deputy's horse shied violently. The second shot came an instant later. It punched a hole through the canvas wagon cover. "Get down!" John roared. He didn't wait to see if Reed obeyed. He grabbed the front of the deputy's shirt and hauled him, sputtering and cursing, clean out of his saddle. Reed landed in a heap on the wagon's running board, his pistol skittering across the floorboards. Two riders appeared on the ridge to their right, their rifles smoking. Syndicate. They weren't the same men from the first crew. These were professionals, their movements economical and deadly. John snapped the reins, a sharp crack of leather that sent the team into a panicked gallop. The heavy wagon bucked and swayed, threatening to tear itself apart on the rough road. Reed scrambled into the seat, his face white. "Who the hell are they?" "The men you were supposed to be chasing," John said. He grabbed his rifle. "Can you drive?" "What? Can you drive a team?" John yelled over the thunder of the hooves. Reed just stared at him, his mouth open. "Take the reins," John said, shoving them into the deputy's hands. "Keep them on the road. Don't stop for anything." He turned, bracing himself against the lurching seat, and brought the rifle to his shoulder. One of the riders was taking aim, a clear shot. John fired. The rider was lifted from his saddle and thrown backward, a rag doll in the bright sunlight. The second rider spurred his horse, coming down the slope at a reckless angle, trying to get ahead of them. "They're trying to box us in!" Reed yelled, his voice thin with panic as he fought the reins. John didn't answer. He was working the lever on the rifle, his movements a fluid, practiced economy. He tracked the second rider, led him by a foot, and squeezed the trigger. The man's horse went down, its front legs buckling, and the rider flew over its head, disappearing in a cloud of dust. It wasn't over. Two more riders appeared on the road ahead of them, blocking the way. The wagon was a moving coffin, caught in a classic pincer. Reed saw the riders ahead and pulled back on the reins in a panic. "We're trapped!" "Keep driving," John commanded. He dropped the rifle, drew his Colt, and fired twice at the men ahead. He wasn't aiming to hit them. He was aiming at the ground in front of their horses. Dirt and rock kicked up, and the animals shied, breaking their line. He had given them a gap. "Now!" John yelled. Reed snapped the reins, his fear replaced by a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. He aimed the team for the gap, the big wagon careening toward the two riders. For a second, it looked like they would stand. Then their nerve broke. They spurred their horses out of the way just as the wagon thundered past, the iron-rimmed wheels missing them by inches. They were through. John looked back. The syndicate men were regrouping, their numbers halved, their charge broken. They were still coming, but the fight was gone from them. He turned and looked at Reed. The deputy's knuckles were white on the reins. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. He had seen a man move through a storm of bullets with a calm, deadly purpose that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with survival. He owed his life to the man he had been trying to arrest. The silence between them was a new kind of law, written in gun smoke and spent cartridges. The office smelled of stale whiskey and another man's ambition. Elias walked behind the big oak desk and sat in the chair as if he'd been born in it. He gestured to the simple wooden chair opposite, an invitation, a command. John didn't take it. He stood in the center of the room, the dust of the trail still on him, a raw, unsettling presence in the tidy space. Through the window, he could see Cale and another man leading a still protesting Deputy Reed toward the saloon. The rest of Silver Creek was a silent audience, watching the closed door of the office, waiting to see which man would walk out. "Bourbon?" Elias asked, sliding a half-full bottle and a clean glass across the polished wood. It was Corbin's. I find his taste in whiskey is better than his business sense. "I'm not here to drink with you," John said. Elias shrugged and poured a drink for himself. "A shame." He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving John's face. "You've had a busy day. You disrupt a syndicate payroll, shoot 4 men, and then deliver the spoils directly to my doorstep. Most men would call that choosing a side." "I chose the miners' side," John said. "The money was theirs." "Was it?" Elias smiled, a confident, knowing expression. "Money belongs to the man strong enough to hold it. You took it from the syndicate. I'll give it to the miners, and in return, they will give me their loyalty, their labor, their future." He leaned forward, the charm replaced by a sharp, analytical intensity. "You see? You didn't just deliver a payroll, John. You delivered the final cornerstone of my new enterprise. You, more than anyone, should understand that." "I understand you built this on a dead banker and a dead marshal," John said, his voice a low, flat line. Elias's smile didn't waver. "Every foundation is laid with stones from a previous structure. Hendricks and Teague were part of an old, inefficient system. They were obstacles to progress. I removed them." He swirled the bourbon in his glass. "You, on the other hand, you're not an obstacle. You're an asset that doesn't yet realize its own value." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the camp that was now his. "Look at them. They're leaderless, afraid. They need a man to provide order, to protect them from wolves like the syndicate. They need a king." He turned back to John. "And every king needs a sword, a man who can enforce the peace, a man who understands that sometimes blood is the only ink that makes a contract binding." "You're talking about a partnership," John said. "I'm talking about an alliance of equals," Elias corrected him, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, persuasive. "You and I, we're the same, John. We're wolves. We see the world as it is, a hard, unforgiving place. The only difference is that you're trying to deny your own nature. You build a house and pretend you're a farmer, but you still wear those guns like a second skin. You still move like a hunter." He walked back and stood in front of the desk, no longer hiding behind it. He was closing the space, a salesman making his final pitch. "Stop fighting it," Elias said. "Stop building a monument to a ghost and help me build an empire for the living. Your reputation, my vision. My gold, your gun. Together, we could own this whole territory by spring. We could make our own laws. We could be the men that other men fear." He held out his hand. "All you have to do is say yes." John looked at the outstretched hand. He saw the easy confidence, the absolute certainty of a man who believed his own lies. He saw the ghost of a boy he had worked beside, the boy who had talked about a better life while planning a murder. He didn't take the hand. He looked past Elias at the new wood of the office, at the stolen whiskey, at the foundation built on blood money. "No," John said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the weight of a hammer blow. Elias's hand stayed in the air for a long second before he slowly let it drop. The smile on his face didn't vanish. It changed. It curdled, the charm freezing into something hard and cold. The warmth in his eyes went out, replaced by a flat, reptilian stillness. "A man can't serve two masters, John," Elias said, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "And it seems you've already chosen yours." He gestured to the graves John carried in his memory. "The dead." The word hung in the air between them, small and hard and final. "No." Elias's smile was a dead thing on his face. The charm had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard bedrock of the man underneath. He looked at John, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his eyes, only a pure, still fury, like the calm at the center of a storm. "The dead are a heavy burden to carry, John," Elias said, his voice a soft, venomous whisper. "They'll drag you down with them." "Some things are worth the weight," John said. He looked past Elias, at the stolen desk, at the office built on a foundation of robbery and murder. "You can't build a house on a grave, Elias. The ground's not stable." "Then I'll dig a new one," Elias said, the softness gone, replaced by a voice like chipping stone. He walked around the desk, his movements slow, deliberate. "And I will bury you under it." He turned and opened the office door. Kayla Jansen stood on the other side, his broken hand now crudely splinted and cradled in a sling. His good hand rested on the butt of his pistol. His eyes, when they met John's, were full of a patient, hateful promise. "Mr. Gantry is leaving," Elias said. He didn't look at John. He was looking out at the muddy street, at the silent, watching miners, his audience. "See that he finds his way out of our town." Cale's grin was a scar on his pale face. "A pleasure." John walked out of the office, his hand loose at his side, away from his gun. He felt the weight of Cale's presence behind him, a predator at his back. He stepped off the porch and into the street. The camp had gone quiet. Every miner, every gambler, every camp follower had stopped what they were doing. They stood in the doorways of their tents and lean-tos, their faces unreadable masks. Yesterday he had been a liberator, the man who brought the payroll. Today, he was the man who had said no to their new king. He was an outcast. He saw Deputy Reed standing on the porch of the saloon. Two of Elias's men, the ones who had been his jailers, stood on either side of him. They weren't holding him, but they might as well have been. The deputy's face was a knot of frustration and impotence. He wore a badge in a town where the law was now whatever Elias Sterling said it was. Reed met John's eyes for a second, then looked away, ashamed. John walked to the spot where he had left the freight wagon. The strongbox was gone. The wagon itself had been moved to the side of the street, empty and abandoned. His gray horse was tied to a hitching rail, saddled and waiting. A gift, a final contemptuous dismissal. He walked to the horse, his boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. He could feel Cale's eyes on his back, could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question of whether he would make it out of the street alive. He put a hand on the saddle horn, but he didn't mount. He turned and looked back at the office. Elias stood on the porch, a proprietor surveying his domain. He held the glass of bourbon in his hand, a king on his throne. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A signal. John's hand dropped to his Colt. Cale drew his pistol with his left hand. The movement was clumsy, a desperate, angry motion. John's gun was already out, the hammer back. He didn't aim at Cale. He aimed at the saloon sign, 20 feet to Cale's left. The shot was a single sharp crack that punched a hole through the painted letters of The Gilded Cage. Cale flinched, his own shot going wide, plowing a harmless furrow in the mud a yard from John's feet. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. John held his pistol steady, the muzzle now aimed at the center of Cale's chest. "You'll need more practice with that hand," John said, his voice carrying in the sudden, dead silence. He held the stare for a long 3 count, then holstered his revolver. He swung up into the saddle, his movements unhurried. He turned the gray and rode out of Silver Creek at a walk, not a run. He didn't look back. He could feel the eyes of the camp on him, the weight of Elias's cold, calculated fury. John made a cold camp in the Badlands, a place of wind-carved rock and silence. He didn't risk a fire. He sat with his back to a slab of sandstone, the rifle across his knees, and watched the stars come out, cold and distant as a banker's heart. He was a man with no destination. He couldn't go back to Bentwood. He couldn't go near Silver Creek. He was an island, and the sea was full of sharks. He was thinking about the woman and the boy, Sarah and Daniel. A ghost of a life he'd almost had. A quiet strength in the middle of a hard country. The memory was an anchor, the only thing that kept him from drifting. He told himself it was just a passing thought, a moment of weakness. He was lying. He saw the rider at dawn, a single man on a tired-looking mule coming up the dry wash from the south. He wasn't one of Elias's men. He didn't have their confident slouch. He rode slumped over like a man carrying bad news. John didn't move. He watched the rider get closer, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. The man saw him from 50 yards out and pulled the mule to a halt. He was a prospector, old and grizzled, his face a roadmap of hard luck. "You John Gantry?" the old man called out, his voice a dry crackle. "Who's asking?" "Name's Jed. I just came from the trading post back east." He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the dry earth. "Storekeeper said you might be out this way. Said you were the one who ran off the first bunch of syndicate men." "I had a conversation with them," John said. "Well, they're having another one," Jed said. He nudged the mule forward a few paces. "What was left of them? 4, maybe 5 riders. They're raising hell. Mad about that payroll you took?" John waited. The old man wasn't here to pass the time. "They ain't going after Silver Creek," Jed said. "They ain't that stupid. They're going after something softer." He looked at John, his eyes full of a weary pity. "There's a woman, a widow, lives a half-day's ride from here. Her boy came into the post this morning, scared half to death. Said the syndicate men rode past his place. Said they told his ma they'd be back by sundown. For provisions." The world went still. The wind died. John could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Sarah and Daniel. "They said they were collecting a tax," Jed continued, his voice a low grumble. "A tax for the trouble you caused them." John's hand tightened on the rifle. He saw it, clean and perfect in his mind. A picture drawn by a master artist, Elias. He had found them. He had learned about the woman and the boy, and he was using them. He wasn't sending his own men. He was letting the syndicate do his dirty work, a pack of rabid dogs let off the leash in a specific direction. It was a message. It was a test. "You care about the innocent? Let's see how much." "It's a trap, you know," Jed said, reading the look on John's face. "They're not just after her chickens. They're after you. They figure you'll come." "You know a lot for a man just passing through," John said, his voice flat. The old prospector looked down at his hands, which were knotted around the mule's reins. "That woman, Sarah, she's my niece. Her husband was a good man, died in a cave-in 2 years back. He looked up, and his eyes were not weary anymore. They were hard. I'm too old to fight 5 men, but I ain't too old to find the man who can. John stood up. He walked to the gray, which was hidden in the rocks, and began to saddle it. "You're going?" Jed asked. "I am." "It's what they want. They'll be waiting for you." "I know." John tightened the cinch, the leather groaning a protest. He had seen the trap the moment the old man spoke. He knew Elias was pulling the strings, testing the limits of the code John lived by. He was using a woman and a child as bait, a move so cold, so precise. It was almost admirable. He knew it was a trap. He knew he was outnumbered. He knew it was probably the last ride he would ever take. He didn't care. A promise to a dead woman was one thing. A debt to a living child was another. He swung into the saddle and looked at the old man. "You keep riding south. Don't look back." He turned the gray and spurred it, not into a run, but into a steady, ground-eating lope. He rode toward the woman's homestead, toward the waiting guns and the ghost of a life he couldn't save, but one he would be damned if he didn't try to defend. The sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. It threw long, distorted shadows that turned the familiar shapes of rock and juniper into watching figures. John rode the last mile with the setting sun at his back, a man chasing his own ghost. He didn't ride straight to the cabin. He left the gray in a deep arroyo a quarter-mile out and went the rest of the way on foot, his rifle in his hands, moving with a silence that was more animal than man. The syndicate men would be careless, overconfident. They would be watching the main trail, expecting the sound of a horse. He came up on the homestead from the high ground, a ridge of broken rock that gave him a clear view of the cabin, the well, the small vegetable patch. Everything was quiet, too quiet. There were no horses at the hitching rail, no smoke from the chimney. The laundry Sarah had been hanging was gone from the line. The place looked abandoned, swept clean by the wind. He watched for a full 10 minutes, his eyes scanning every shadow, every window. Nothing. The silence was a lie. He could feel it, a wrongness in the air, a held breath. He moved down the slope, using the scattered boulders for cover. He reached the lone cottonwood tree and paused, listening. The only sound was the rustle of dry leaves, a lonely, whispering sound. The front door of the cabin was closed. He circled around to the back. A small window was dark. The place felt empty, a hollowed-out shell. He put a hand on the back door. It was unlatched. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin's single room was dim, the last of the daylight struggling to get through the 2 small windows. A fire was laid in the hearth but unlit. A plate with a half-eaten piece of bread sat on the small wooden table. It was as if someone had left in the middle of a meal. Then he saw the boy, Daniel. He was sitting on a small stool in the darkest corner of the room, his back to the wall. He wasn't crying. He was just sitting there, unnaturally still, his small hands clutching the carved piece of wood John had seen him with before. "Daniel," John said, his voice a low whisper, "where's your mother?" The boy didn't answer. He just looked at him, his eyes wide and dark in the gloom. It wasn't the look of a boy who was scared of outlaws. It was the look of a boy who had been told to be quiet, to be good. The floorboards creaked behind him. John turned, the rifle coming up, the movement a blur of instinct. Sarah stood in the doorway of the small sleeping alcove. She didn't have her Spencer. Her hands were empty, clasped in front of her. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of regret and a hard, brittle resolve. "He's not here, John," she said, her voice quiet. "The syndicate men, they never came." The words hung in the air, a new kind of trap, one made of lies instead of bullets. John looked from her face to the still, silent boy in the corner. He understood. He had walked right into the cage, and the door had just swung shut behind him. "Hello, John." The voice came from the sleeping alcove. It was smooth, calm, and utterly familiar. Elias Sterling stepped out from the shadows. He wasn't holding a gun, he was holding a cup of coffee. He looked fresh, clean, as if he had just stepped out of a townhouse instead of a sod-walled cabin in the middle of nowhere. Two of his men, the hard case named Miller and another with eyes like a dead fish, stepped out behind him, their rifles held at a low, casual ready. "You're a difficult man to arrange a meeting with," Elias said, a polite, almost friendly smile on his face. He took a sip of his coffee. "I find it's always best to choose a neutral location." John didn't lower the rifle. He kept it aimed at the center of Elias's chest. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes didn't meet his. She was looking at the floor, at the cold, hard-packed earth of her home. "Why?" John asked her. The word was a piece of broken glass in his throat. She finally looked at him, and he saw the desperation in her eyes, the fierce, protective fire of a mother making a hard choice. "He offered us a future," she said, her voice a near whisper. "A place in Silver Creek, a school for Daniel, protection." She looked at Elias, then back at John. "He's building something. You're just tearing things down." "He's a thief and a killer," John said, his voice flat. "He's a king," she corrected him, the words simple, final. "And this world is hard on people who don't have a king." The betrayal was a cold, clean blade in his gut. It wasn't about greed. It was about survival, a choice between a ghost who offered nothing but the danger that followed him and a prince who offered a place in his kingdom. "The gun, John," Elias said, his voice still pleasant. "There's no need for it. The conversation is over. You've lost." John looked at the boy, who was still watching him with those wide, silent eyes. He looked at Sarah, at the hard choice she had made. He looked at Elias, at the smiling, confident face of the man who had outplayed him at every turn. He could fire. He could probably kill Elias before the other two shot him down. But it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't save the boy. It wouldn't unmake Sarah's choice. It would just be more blood on a floor that had seen too much grief already. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. Miller stepped forward and took it from his hands. The other man moved behind him and expertly unbuckled his gun belt, pulling the two Colts free. The weight was gone from his hips. He felt unarmed. He felt naked. Elias walked over and stood in front of him. He looked from John to Sarah, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He had baited the trap with the one thing he knew John could not resist, a chance to be the hero. "You see, John," Elias said, his voice a soft, pitying murmur. "You can't build a house on a grave, but you can build an empire on hope." They didn't tie him up. There was no need. The two men with rifles, Miller and the other one, were the ropes. Sarah's quiet, averted gaze was the lock on the door. The boy, Daniel, watching him from the corner with wide, unreadable eyes, was the final turn of the key. Elias sat at the small wooden table, the cup of coffee cradled in his hands. He looked like a man visiting a neighbor. He gestured with his chin to the other chair. "Sit down, John. Please. We have a long night ahead." John didn't move. He stood in the center of the small room, a prisoner in a house he had come to save. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and betrayal. "There's nothing to talk about," John said. "That's where you're wrong," Elias said, his voice a model of calm reason. "We have everything to talk about. We're going to talk about the nature of progress, about the cost of building a better world." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Sarah, would you be so kind as to put on a fresh pot? I imagine our guest could use one." Sarah moved from the doorway, her steps quiet, her eyes on the floor. She took the pot from the hearth and went to the water bucket, her movements stiff, automatic. She was a ghost in her own home. "You see that?" Elias asked, his voice a low murmur. That is order. That is a woman who has a future, a place where her son will be safe and educated. I offered her that. All you offered her was a memory of a good man who died in the dirt. He leaned forward. You live your life by a code written for a world that doesn't exist anymore, John. A world of clear lines between right and wrong. But the lines have been washed away. There's only what you can hold, what you can build. You didn't build this, John said, his voice flat. You stole the materials. And what is all of history but one great act of theft? Elias countered, a teacher patiently explaining a concept to a slow student. Every kingdom is built on the ruins of another. Every fortune is seeded with a grubstake taken from someone else. The difference is what you do with it. Corbin and his syndicate, they were just parasites. They bled this territory for profit. I am investing. I am creating a community. I am turning stolen money into hope. You saw the faces of those miners. Did they look like the subjects of a tyrant? John didn't answer. He looked at the boy, Daniel, who was now trying to make himself smaller in the corner, whittling at his piece of wood with small, jerky motions. You think because you wear your guilt like a shield that it makes you righteous, Elias continued, his voice weaving a cage of words around John. You think because you made a promise to a dead woman that you reabsolved of your own nature. But you're a killer, John. You have a talent for it, a gift, and you waste it, clinging to a moral code that got your wife killed and left you to build a house on her ashes. The mention of Mary was a deliberate surgical strike. John's hands, loose at his sides, curled into fists. Miller, the man by the door, shifted his weight, the rifle held a little tighter. Sarah stopped her work at the hearth, her back rigid. Elias. The word was a quiet plea. Elias ignored her. His eyes were locked on John's, probing, testing. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to make you see. I am offering you the one thing you've never had, a purpose for your violence, a chance to use that gift to build, not just to avenge, to be the sword of a just king instead of the ghost haunting a forgotten grave. John finally moved. He walked to the cold hearth and stood beside Sarah, his back to Elias. He looked at the unlit fire. You talk a lot about kings and empires. It's the language of men who shape the world, Elias said from the table. John turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Elias's. You're just a man who robs banks and shoots sheriffs in the back. The rest is just a story you tell yourself so you can sleep at night. The smile on Elias's face didn't waver, but it didn't reach his eyes. The words had found their mark. And what story do you tell yourself, John? Elias asked softly. The one where you're the hero? Look around you. The woman you came to save has locked the door behind you. The law you tried to help is hunting you. You have nothing. No home, no allies, no purpose, except a debt to a man you've already killed. He stood up, his movements fluid and confident. I've won, not because my gun is faster, but because my world is real, and yours is a ghost story. He walked to the cabin door. Miller will stay with you. The rest of us will make camp outside. We'll ride for Silver Creek in the morning. He paused, his hand on the latch. Think about what I've said. Think about what a man with your talents could do with a real foundation under his feet. He opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving John alone in a room with his ghosts. A woman who had chosen another man's future, and a boy who had just seen the world for what it was. The sun came up on a world made of glass. A hard frost had settled overnight, coating the sagebrush and the barren rock in a brittle, shining layer. From a half-mile away, hidden in a cleft of rock, Deputy Reed watched the small sod cabin through a pair of field glasses. He had followed John, had seen the trap, had watched Elias Sterling and his men take a legend without firing a shot. There had been nothing he could do. 2 rifles against 5 with a woman and a child in the middle. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. He lowered the glasses, the cold metal an ache against his skin. He had spent the night wrestling with the badge on his vest. The law said he should ride for help, form a proper posse. His gut told him that by the time he got back, John Gantry would be a name on a tombstone, and Elias Thorne would be halfway to Mexico. He watched as two men came out of the cabin, Elias and the one called Miller. They spoke for a moment, then Miller and another man, a quiet one with dead eyes, saddled their horses. They weren't riding with the urgency of a war party. They rode out slow, splitting up, one heading north, the other east. Patrol, a king checking the borders of his new tiny kingdom. Reed made his choice. He didn't follow Miller, the true believer. He followed the other one, the one who rode like it was just a job. He kept his distance, a gray ghost in a gray landscape, letting the man get a mile from the cabin before he spurred his horse into a low, ground-eating canter. He came up on him from the side, not the back, making no effort to hide his approach. The man heard him. He pulled his horse to a halt and turned, his rifle coming up to rest across his saddle horn. He watched Reed approach, his face a blank, professional calm. Reed stopped 20 feet away, his hands in plain sight. That's far enough. The man's dead eyes took in the badge on Reed's vest. He didn't look impressed. You're a long way from your jurisdiction, lawman. The law doesn't stop at a county line when a man's been taken, Reed said. The man almost smiled. He wasn't taken. He walked in. Now, unless you've got a warrant signed by God himself, I suggest you turn that horse around. I'm not here to serve a warrant, Reed said. I'm here to talk business. The man's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. I'm not in business with the law. You're in business with Elias Thorne, Reed said. I hear it's profitable, for now. He let the words hang in the cold air. You're Bishop, right? Used to ride with the Logan boys before the Rangers scattered them. Bishop's face went hard. You know a lot. It's my job to know things, Reed said. I know you're a man who works for a wage. You're not a believer. You're an employee. And I'm here to tell you the company you reworking for is about to go bankrupt. Bishop's rifle didn't move. Sterling's got $10,000 of the Bentwood bank's money. That's a long way from bankrupt. He's got the syndicate breathing down his neck, Reed countered, his voice low and reasonable. He has got a vendetta with John Gantry that's more important to him than his own payroll. He's sitting on a powder keg, and his obsession with one old man is about to light the fuse. Is that what you signed on for? I signed on for a share, Bishop said, his eyes narrowed. A share of what? A mining camp that's about to become a war zone? Reed pushed his horse a step closer. The syndicate isn't just going to forget about that payroll Gantry took. They'll be back. And the territorial marshal AS office isn't going to forget about a dead lawman in Bentwood. Sooner or later, the real law with real numbers is going to come knocking. And what is your boss doing? He's playing head games with a ghost in a sod cabin. Bishop didn't answer. He was listening. The seed of doubt was a small, cold thing, but it was there. You're a smart man, Bishop, Reed said, pressing his advantage. You know this can't last. A kingdom built this fast falls just as fast. He paused. I'm not asking you to switch sides. I'm just giving you a professional courtesy, a warning. When the shooting starts, and it will, make sure you re-standing on the side that is still going to be there when the smoke clears. Reed looked at him for a long moment, then pulled the reins, turning his horse. Where do you think you're going, lawman? Bishop asked, his voice a low growl. Reed looked back over his shoulder. To do my job, to watch, to wait. He gave a small, humorless smile. You tell Elias I came by to talk, but I don't think you will. He spurred his horse and rode off, a lone figure disappearing back into the rocks. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel Bishop's eyes on him, the eyes of a man who had just been reminded that loyalty is a luxury and survival is a currency all its own. The first crack in the foundation had appeared. The gunfire started as a faint popping in the distance, like dry twigs snapping in a fire. It was easy to ignore at first. John sat on the floor of the cabin, his back against the rough-hewn logs, and watched Elias pace. The Prince of Silver Creek was a caged tiger, his long night of psychological warfare having failed to produce the satisfying crack in John's spirit he had been looking for. Sarah moved like a ghost in the small room, clearing away the breakfast things, her eyes never meeting John's. The boy, Daniel, was outside, listlessly tossing a rock against the side of the well. The air was thick with the silence of a battle of wills that had reached a stalemate. The popping sound came again, closer this time. A volley, sharp and distinct on the cold morning air. Miller, the true believer who stood guard by the door, looked at Elias. What was that? Elias stopped his pacing. He tilted his head, listening. The sound came again. A rolling, angry rattle this time. It wasn't target practice. It was a fight. They're early, Elias said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. He walked to the cabin door and looked out, not in the direction of the sound, but north, as if expecting to see Deputy Reed riding over the horizon. A horse came over the southern ridge at a dead run, its sides lathered, its rider low in the saddle. It was one of the men Elias had left to guard the pass to Silver Creek. He galloped right up to the cabin and threw himself from the saddle before the horse had stopped moving. "Syndicate!" the rider gasped, his chest heaving. "A dozen of them, maybe more. They came up the old mining trail, hit the south camp an hour ago. Cale's holding them, but they're pushing hard." Elias's face was a calm, cold mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. The deputy's warning. He had dismissed it as a lawman's bluff. He had been so focused on the ghost in the cabin that he had forgotten about the wolves at the door. "Bishop's men?" Elias asked, his voice sharp. "Haven't seen 'em," the rider said. "They were supposed to be watching the east flank. They're just gone." The seed Reed had planted had taken root. Bishop, the pragmatist, had taken his wages and disappeared, leaving a gaping hole in the defenses. "Get every man," Elias said to Miller, his voice like chipping ice. "Don't let them get a foothold on this side of the ridge. I'll be right behind you." Miller nodded and ran for his horse, shouting orders to the other men camped outside. The quiet homestead exploded into a chaos of running men and shouted commands. Elias turned back into the cabin. He looked at John, who hadn't moved from his spot on the floor. "It seems your lawman friend was more persuasive than I gave him credit for." "A man who works for money is only loyal to the last dollar," John said, his voice flat. Elias's eyes were burning with a cold, controlled fury. His perfect kingdom, his ordered world, was coming apart at the seams because of this man, because of a ghost he couldn't break and a lawman he had underestimated. He walked over and stood over John, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "This changes nothing between us. When I'm done with them, I'm coming back for you." "You have to win first," John said. The truth of it hung in the air between them. Elias was caught. He couldn't stay here and play his mind games while his empire burned. He couldn't take John with him into a gunfight. And he couldn't kill him. Not yet. Killing him now would be an admission of defeat, a concession that he couldn't win the argument, only the fight. He looked at Sarah, who stood frozen by the cold hearth. "You'll watch him. If he tries to leave, you know what to do." She nodded, her face pale. The promise of a safe future was being paid for with the currency of a hostage. Elias strode to the door. "Cale is to fall back to the assay office if he's pushed. Tell him to hold it at all costs." He looked one last time at John, his face a mask of cold resolve. "This is my house, Gantry, and I don't suffer ghosts." He walked out, and a moment later John heard the frantic drumming of his horse's hooves as he rode toward the sound of the guns, a king riding to save a kingdom that was already under siege from within. The cabin had become a listening post. The sounds of the fight rolled up the valley from the south, a steady, vicious rhythm of rifle fire punctuated by the deeper boom of a shotgun. John sat on the floor, a still point in a world that had gone loud. He was counting the shots, mapping the battle in his mind. A volley, then a pause. A single rifle answering from a different position. Elias's men were holding, but they were outnumbered. Sarah stood by the single window that faced the sound, her arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't watching John anymore. She was watching a pillar of smoke rise from the direction of the south camp, a dark stain against the pale blue sky. The future Elias had promised her was being decided a mile away with lead and powder. The boy, Daniel, sat at the table, his small hands trying to work his piece of wood, but his eyes kept darting from his mother's rigid back to the quiet, unnerving stillness of the man on the floor. "He's losing," John said. The words were flat, a statement of fact, not an opinion. Sarah didn't turn. "You don't know that." "I know the sound of a falling back action," John said. "They're giving ground. The syndicate is pushing them toward the assay office." The back door of the cabin creaked open. Sarah spun around, a gasp catching in her throat. John was on his feet in a single fluid motion, his body tensed, ready. Deputy Reed stood in the doorway, his pistol in his hand. He wasn't looking at John. He was looking at Sarah. His face was grim, his eyes tired. He had the look of a man who had run out of patience. "Ma'am," Reed said, his voice low but firm, "I'm not here to cause you any trouble, but the man Elias left to watch the North Pass took a ride, so the back door is open." He gestured with his pistol toward John. "I'm here for him." Sarah looked from the deputy to John. She was caught between two kinds of law, and both of them carried guns. "You can't. Elias is busy," Reed cut her off, his voice sharp. "He's about to lose everything he stole. And when the syndicate is done with him, they'll be coming for this place. For his supplies, for his horses." He let his eyes rest on the boy who had frozen at the table. "For anything they can carry." The truth of it was a cold, hard slap. The protection Elias had offered was an illusion, a promise that was currently being shot to pieces a mile away. "Give him the guns, ma'am," Reed said, his voice softening slightly. "Let us get out of your house. Let us finish this, so you and your boy can have some peace." Sarah's resolve crumbled. She looked at John, her eyes full of a desperate, pleading apology. She walked to the sleeping alcove and came back with his gun belt. She didn't hand it to him. She laid it on the table, the heavy leather making a soft thud on the wood. John walked to the table and picked it up. He buckled it around his hips, the weight of the two Colts a familiar, grim reassurance. He looked at Sarah. "You and the boy, get what you can carry and head east. Don't stop until you hit the trading post." "And then?" she whispered. "And then you don't look back," John said. He turned to Reed. The deputy hadn't lowered his pistol. "The warrant from Bentwood is still open, Gantry." "Then you'll have to come and get me when I'm done," John said. He walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Reed asked. "Elias has men holed up in the assay office," John said, thinking aloud, his mind already on the battlefield. "The syndicate will surround it. Try to starve them out." He looked at Reed. "That gives us the high ground." He stepped out into the cold, bright sunlight. Reed was a half-step behind him. John was a free man, free to ride away, to disappear, and let the wolves devour each other. The lawman had given him the choice. He looked south, at the smoke and the distant angry rattle of the guns. He saw the faces of the miners, men who had traded one master for another. He saw the boy, Daniel, watching him from the cabin doorway, a small, silent figure caught in the crossfire. He owed them, all of them. "The syndicate has a camp on the East Ridge," John said to Reed, his voice low and hard. "Their supply line, their reserve ammunition." He turned, and for the first time he looked at the deputy not as a lawman, but as a soldier. "A kingdom is just a house, deputy. You want to bring it down, you don't kick in the front door. You set a fire in the basement. The East Ridge was a spine of broken granite and stunted, wind-scoured pine. John and Deputy Reed moved along its flank, keeping below the skyline, two ghosts in a world of rock and distant gunfire. Reed was breathing hard, the climb and the tension taking their toll. John moved with a steady, unhurried pace, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "This is insane," Reed said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "We should be down there, helping them." He gestured toward the valley, where the sound of the fight was a steady, angry drumming. "You want to help a man who's holding a woman and child hostage?" John asked without looking at him. "No, I want to stop a massacre," Reed shot back. "There are miners in that camp, families. And what happens when the syndicate wins?" John countered, his voice flat. "They take the camp. They take the mines. The families get to starve under a new master. Nothing changes." He stopped, crouching behind a gnarled juniper that clung to the rock. "We're not here to win their fight. We're here to end it." He pointed. Below them, tucked into a box canyon, was the syndicate's rear camp. It wasn't much. 2 canvas tents, a picket line with a dozen horses, and a heavy freight wagon parked near a smoldering fire. 3 men were in the camp. One was cleaning a rifle. The other 2 were playing cards on an overturned barrel. They were relaxed, confident, their backs to the real war happening a mile away. "Their supply line," John said. "Their reserve ammunition is in that wagon." Reed looked from the camp to the distant battle. The pieces clicked into place. "If they run out of bullets..." "The fight's over," John finished for him. "They'll have to pull back. Elias wins a battle he was about to lose." "And you'll have saved him," Reed said, the accusation plain in his voice. "I'll have saved the camp," John corrected him. "There's a difference." He looked at the deputy, his eyes hard and clear. "You're the law. You see a line between 2 sides. I see a fire, and a lot of people about to get burned. I'm putting out the fire." He laid out the plan, his voice a low murmur that was almost part of the wind. It was simple. It was clean. It was deadly. Reed listened, his own training and instincts wrestling with the cold, hard logic of the man in front of him. This wasn't law enforcement. This was surgery with a rifle. He gave a single, sharp nod. They separated, Reed circling south to a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear shot into the canyon, John moving north, closer, using a deep, shadow-filled fissure to get within 100 yards of the wagon. They waited. The sun was hot on the rock. Down below, the card game ended. One of the men stood up, stretched, and walked toward the horses. A single rifle shot cracked from the south. Reed's shot. It wasn't aimed at a man. It hit a stack of tin plates near the fire, sending them spinning into the air with a loud, metallic clang. The 3 men in the camp reacted instantly. They grabbed their rifles, their heads snapping toward the sound, toward the south. They were looking for an attack from the direction of Silver Creek. They never looked north. John rose from the fissure, the rifle already at his shoulder. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the back of the wagon. He could see the corners of the wooden ammunition crates through the open canvas flap. He fired once. The heavy slug punched through the side of the wagon, a clean, dark hole in the weathered wood. For a second, nothing happened. Then a thin wisp of smoke curled out of the hole. One of the men saw it. He yelled something, a word lost in the wind, and started running toward the wagon. It was too late. A crate of rifle cartridges cooked off. The sound was not a single shot, but a rolling, crackling roar, like a string of firecrackers the size of cannons. The side of the wagon blew out in a shower of splintered wood. A second crate went, then a third. A chain reaction of violent, uncontrolled explosions. Bullets whined through the camp, ricocheting off the canyon walls. The 3 syndicate men dove for cover, their own ammunition now the enemy. The horses on the picket line screamed and broke free, galloping madly out of the canyon. Down in Silver Creek, the sound of the exploding ammunition was a new and terrifying thunder. The syndicate men laying siege to the assay office faltered. They looked back over their shoulders and saw the thick black smoke pouring from the direction of their own camp. Their supply line was gone. Their reserve was under attack. They were cut off. The steady, confident rhythm of their rifle fire sputtered and died. An order was shouted, a bugle of retreat in a voice raw with panic. The siege was broken. Up on the ridge, John watched the smoke climb into the sky. He hadn't killed a single man. He hadn't fired a shot in defense of Elias Sterling. He had simply kicked out the foundation, and the house had started to fall. He turned and melted back into the rocks, the architect of a victory no one in the valley below would ever know he had won. The silence rolled down from the east ridge and settled over Silver Creek like a shroud. The last of the syndicate riders had disappeared over the horizon, a scattered, panicked retreat. From the windows of the assay office, Cale Jansen and the 4 other men who had held the line watched them go. They didn't cheer. They were alive, but they hadn't won. The enemy had simply vanished. Elias Sterling rode into the camp an hour later. He found his men standing in the muddy street, their rifles held loosely, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. Cale met him, his good hand resting on his pistol, his bad one a throbbing, useless weight in its sling. "They broke," Cale said, his voice a low growl. "Just broke and ran, after the explosions up on the ridge." He looked at Elias, a question in his eyes. "What happened up there?" Elias didn't answer. He swung down from his horse, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He knew what had happened. It wasn't Bishop's betrayal. It wasn't the syndicate's courage failing. It was a ghost who had moved a piece on the board and checkmated the entire game. He strode toward his office, the one he had taken from Corbin. It was supposed to be the seat of his new government. Now it felt like a tomb. He could feel the eyes of the miners on him, the men he had saved. Their loyalty was a fragile, temporary thing, bought with a victory he hadn't earned. He walked into the office and stopped. His men, Cale and Miller and the others, followed him in, crowding the doorway, waiting for orders, for an explanation. The room wasn't empty. John Gantry stood by the window, looking out at the camp. Deputy Reed was sitting in the chair opposite Elias's desk, a shotgun resting across his lap. They hadn't come in shooting. They had walked in and waited. Elias's men reached for their guns. "Don't," John said without turning from the window. The word was quiet, but it was not a request. Elias looked at the faces of his men. He saw the hesitation, the doubt. They had followed him because he was a winner, a man with a plan. Now their victory felt hollow, and the man he had declared their enemy was standing in their headquarters, waiting for them. "Get out," Elias said to his men. His voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Cale's hand tightened on his pistol. "Boss, we can take them." "I said, get out." Elias turned, and the cold, absolute certainty was gone from his eyes. In its place was a raw, burning frustration, the look of a master chess player who has just had his board kicked over. The men looked at each other, then at Elias. One by one, they backed out of the office, leaving him alone with his ghosts. Elias walked to his desk and stood behind it, the polished wood a useless barricade. He looked from John to the deputy. "The architect of my victory. Come to claim your credit?" "There was no victory," John said, finally turning from the window. "Just a fire put out before it burned down the whole town. You saved them," Elias said, a sneer in his voice. "These people. They were mine. I was building something for them. Order. Prosperity." "You were building a cage," John said. Elias slammed his hand down on the desk. The sound was a sharp, cracking report in the silent room. "I offered you a place in it. I offered you a partnership. We could have owned this territory." "There's the difference between us," John said. "You want to own things, people, land. And you?" Elias's voice was a raw, ragged sound, the voice of a man watching his dream turn to smoke. "What do you want, John? To live alone in a half-built house on a patch of cursed ground? To spend the rest of your life haunted by a promise you couldn't keep? He spread his hands, a gesture of desperate, pleading reason. Why? After all this, why did you do it? John looked at the man who called himself a prince. He saw the ambition, the vision, the cold, hard brilliance. He saw the dead banker in Bentwood and the marshal lying in the street. He saw the foundation. It wasn't yours to build, John said. The words were simple. They were not an accusation. They were a judgment. They struck Elias with more force than a bullet. The ambition in his eyes guttered and went out, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. He had built his empire on a flaw, a single, simple truth he had ignored, and this man, this ghost, had just held it up for him to see. He sank into his chair, a king with no kingdom, a builder with no foundation. The silence in the room was the sound of a world collapsing. The silence in the room was a dead weight. Elias sat slumped in his chair, a king in a ruined court, the architect of an empire that had existed only in his own mind. The ambition had been bled out of him, leaving behind a hollow, brittle shell. Deputy Reed stood up slowly, the shotgun held at a low ready. He was the law again. Not the swaggering, uncertain boy from Bentwood, but a man who had seen the real cost of a badge. He looked at Elias, his face a grim mask. "Elias Sterling," Reed said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "You're under arrest for the robbery of the Bentwood Bank and for the murder of Marshal Teague." Elias didn't seem to hear him. He was staring at his own hands, lying empty on the polished surface of the desk, the hands that were meant to build an empire. "It was a clean plan," Elias whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "A perfect grubstake. Everything was accounted for." He looked up, his eyes finding John's, and a flicker of the old charismatic fire returned, twisted now into something desperate and ugly. "It was you. You were the variable I couldn't solve for, the ghost in the machine." "Get up," Reed said, his voice harder now. "Slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Elias looked at the deputy as if seeing him for the first time. He saw the badge, the shotgun, the unwavering line of the law. He saw the end of his road. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "The law?" Elias said, the word a sneer. "A set of rules for sheep, enforced by dogs." He moved. It wasn't a quick draw. It was a single, fluid motion of a man who had accepted his own end and wanted only to choose the final punctuation. His hand shot into the open top drawer of the desk, the one where Corbin had kept his whiskey. It came out holding a small, silver-plated derringer. He didn't aim it at John. John was an idea, a ghost he could no longer fight. He aimed it at the deputy, at the law, the thing that had finally cornered him. John moved a half step, his own gun coming up, but he was too far away. Deputy Reed did not hesitate. He did not shout a warning. He did not try to talk the man down. He had seen enough death. He simply did the job. The shotgun roared, a single deafening blast that filled the small office with thunder and smoke. The heavy buckshot hit Elias square in the chest, lifting him from his chair and slamming him back against the wall. The derringer fired into the ceiling, a harmless pop lost in the echo of the shotgun. Elias slid to the floor, leaving a dark, wet smear on the wall behind him. He lay in a heap, his eyes open, staring at the ruin of his own grand design. The Prince of Silver Creek was dead. The silence that came back was profound, broken only by the smell of burnt gunpowder and the soft ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Reed stood over the body, the shotgun still smoking in his hands. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. He had done it. He had ended it. He worked the action on the shotgun, ejecting the spent shell, which clattered on the floorboards. He looked at John, who stood by the window, a silent, grim-faced witness. "It's over," Reed said. The words sounded small in the big silence. John just nodded. He walked to the door and looked out. The sound of the shotgun had brought the camp to a standstill. Cale and the other men stood in the street, their faces a mixture of shock and a dawning, uncertain freedom. Their king was dead. Reed came and stood beside him in the doorway. "The story," the deputy said, his voice low. "The one I'll tell back in Bentwood. It'll be the truth. How you warned Teague. How you came after Sterling, not for the money, but for the marshal he killed." He looked at John. "I'll tell them how you dismantled his whole operation, how you faced him down, how the law, in the end, prevailed." "That the story you're telling?" John asked. "It's the one that's true," Reed said. "Your name will be cleared, Gantry. The town owes you a debt." John looked out at the muddy, chaotic street of Silver Creek. He looked at the hard, desperate faces of the miners. He thought of the half-built house on the burned-out land, the 2 graves on the ridge. He hadn't done any of this for a clear name or a town's gratitude. He had done it because a debt was owed, and he was the only one left to pay it. "The town doesn't owe me anything," John said. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the hitching rail where his horse was tied, leaving the deputy to his report, the dead man to his silence, and the town to its uncertain future. The ride was long and silent, a slow unwinding of the tension that had been coiled in John's gut for weeks. He didn't push the gray. He let the horse find its own pace, a steady walk that ate the miles without hurry. The land was the same, the sky was the same, but the man in the saddle was different. The weight of the guns on his hips was no longer a burden or a betrayal. It was just a fact. He came over the last rise as the sun was setting, the homestead spread out below him in the long, golden light. The half-built house stood waiting, its raw pine frame a skeleton against the evening sky. It looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile. He rode to the well and swung down, his movements stiff, every muscle aching. He let the horse drink its fill from the trough, then unsaddled it and turned it loose in the small corral he had built weeks ago, a lifetime ago. He didn't go to the house. He walked up the gentle slope of the ridge to the 2 simple wooden crosses that stood outlined against the darkening sky. He stopped a few feet away. The wind was quiet up here. The world was quiet. He had broken his promise. He had dug up the guns. He had brought violence back into his life. He stood before the graves of his wife and son, and he had no words of apology. He had only the truth of what he had done. He had paid a debt. He had put out a fire. He stayed until the stars came out, a cold, hard scatter of diamonds on black velvet. Then he walked back down the ridge. He took off the gun belt and laid it on the foundation stones of the house. He didn't clean the guns. He didn't unload them. He just looked at them for a long time in the moonlight. He had tried to bury them once. It hadn't worked. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He picked up the belt and carried it inside the open frame of the house, placing it on a crossbeam in the corner, out of the way, but not out of sight. A tool, like any other, to be used only when needed. He was standing there, looking at the empty space that would one day be a room when he heard the horse. A single rider coming in slow. He didn't reach for the guns. He just waited. A moment later, Deputy Reed rode into the clearing and dismounted. He looked tired, the trail dust heavy on his shoulders, but the uncertainty was gone from his eyes. He looked at the house, then at John. "Took you long enough to get here," Reed said. "Wasn't in a hurry," John answered. Reed walked over to the stack of fresh-cut lumber that lay beside the foundation. Elias's lumber. He looked at it, then at the house. He bent down and picked up a spare hammer, the one Elias had used, its handle worn smooth. He tested the weight of it in his hand. He walked to the edge of the foundation and stood there, looking at the place where a wall was meant to be. "Figured you could use some help with that," Reed said. The words hung in the quiet air, an echo of the offer that had started the bloodshed. But the voice was different. The man was different. It wasn't a proposition. It was an offer. John looked at the deputy, a boy who had become a man in a storm of gun smoke. He looked at the graves on the ridge, a memory that would always be a part of him. He looked at the house, a future that was not a promise, but a choice, waiting to be built. The ghost inside him, the one that had raged and mourned and demanded vengeance, was quiet. It hadn't vanished. It had just finally sat down, content to watch the work begin. John walked over to the lumber pile, picked up his own hammer, and stepped up onto the foundation. He nodded once. The sound of the first nail being driven home was a sharp, clean report in the vast, waiting silence of the west. A moment later, a second hammer joined the first, their two rhythms finding a new, steady beat in the quiet of the coming dawn.